Before we get into the story, please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments. My name is Liana, I'm 36 years old, and today I want to talk about an experience that has touched me deeply, something I shared with my nephew, Jalen. It was a connection that unfolded gradually, starting one quiet evening in Maruga. My husband, Aaron, had been working tirelessly on a big project in Dala for months. His days were filled with long hours at the construction site, leaving our home quieter and emptier than ever. It had become common for him to leave early in the morning and return late at night, if at all. This routine meant that we rarely saw each other, and the little moments we used to share had all but disappeared. I remember feeling particularly drained and lonely that night, weighed down by a sense of emptiness that had been slowly creeping in over the past few weeks. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that the silence of the empty house would give me some much-needed rest. As I lay there, enveloped in the silence, I began to drift off to sleep, feeling a rare sense of peace and comfort. But then something stirred me from my slumber. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Slowly opening my eyes, I saw my nephew, Jalen, standing at the foot of my bed. He was holding a notebook and looking slightly anxious, as if he didn't want to disturb me but had no choice. "Sorry to wake you, Liana, but I need this notebook for a university assignment, and I couldn't find it anywhere else," he said, his voice soft and apologetic. Jalen had always been polite and considerate, so his unexpected presence in my room at this hour took me by surprise. Still half asleep, I sat up, adjusted my nightgown, and managed to give him a gentle, reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Jalen, it's all right." "Why don't you sit down for a while?" I said, gesturing to a chair by my bed. He seemed hesitant, but after a moment's pause, he accepted the invitation and sat down in the chair. As he did so, we began to chat, and our conversation naturally turned to his studies. Jalen was in his final year of university, and he explained how challenging this final stretch had been for him. He talked about his workload, the pressure of exams, and the late nights spent studying. As he spoke, I was captivated by the maturity in his voice and the thoughtfulness of his expression. It struck me that Jalen was no longer the boy I remembered, but a young man with intelligence and sensitivity, qualities I had always admired in him. It was like seeing him through new eyes, recognizing the strength and determination he had cultivated over the years. At one point in the conversation, he paused and looked at me with a faint, shy smile. "Thank you for listening, Liana." "Sometimes it's hard to find someone to talk to," he admitted. His honesty touched me deeply. It was then that I assured him that I would always be there to listen and support him, no matter what. And as I said these words, I felt a warmth in my heart, realizing how important this connection was to me. It was as if some of the loneliness I'd been carrying had been lifted, replaced by a real sense of closeness that I hadn't felt in a long time. That night marked the beginning of something new and unexpected between us. In the days that followed, I found that Jalen and I began to talk more often, and his presence became a welcome addition to my life. With Aaron away, my days had felt monotonous and empty, but Jalen brought a sense of companionship and understanding that filled the void. Our conversations became a valued part of my routine, a break in the silence that had settled over my life. Over the weeks, my relationship with Jalen became a refuge, a space of warmth and support in the midst of loneliness. We often met in the kitchen, where he helped me prepare meals, or in my bedroom, where we talked about everything from his dreams and aspirations to the everyday challenges he faced. It was in these moments that I came to appreciate the depth of our bond, a bond that offered me comfort, understanding, and a reminder of the beauty of human connection. Each evening spent in his company reminded me of the value of having someone to lean on, someone who truly listens and cares. And although it began as a simple gesture, his visit soon became something I looked forward to. A quiet yet profound connection that brought light into my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. One night, after many of our late-night conversations, there was a shift between us, almost imperceptible at first. We were sitting together, and Jalen, always curious and thoughtful, asked a question that took me by surprise. He looked at me and said, "Liana, have you ever considered following your dreams? You've been so supportive of everyone else, but what about what you want?" The question took me by surprise because, to be honest, no one had asked me that in a long time. His sincerity stirred something deep inside me, reminding me of the passions and aspirations I had once held dear. I answered him honestly, telling him about the dreams I'd once had and how they had slowly faded into the background as I built a life with Aaron. Although Aaron and I had a stable life, it often felt like a comfortable trap, especially with the endless hours he devoted to his work. Over time, the constant distance created a quiet space between us, and the feeling of being alone, even within a marriage, had begun to creep in. Jalen listened with an expression of empathy and understanding that was both comforting and profound. "It must be hard, Auntie," he said gently. "I've always seen you as a strong person, but we all need someone to lean on." His words struck a chord with me. I had always taken on the role of the caretaker, the one who kept everything in order. But I had forgotten how much I needed support, understanding, and, above all, someone who really saw me. It was then that I realized that Jalen's youth and empathy brought me a comfort I hadn't realized I was longing for. As the evening progressed, our conversation flowed naturally. We laughed, shared stories, and talked about things we'd never talked about before. The bond we shared felt deeper than ever, and the connection between us seemed to take on a new life. There was a warmth in Jalen's smile and an intensity in his gaze that I couldn't ignore, try as I might. It was as if he could see right through me, and I began to feel things I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. There was a vulnerability in me that night, a vulnerability that found comfort in his presence. It was then that Jalen gently broke through my thoughts and suggested I get some rest. As he got up to leave, he assured me that he would always be there if I needed him. When I was finally alone in the dark, my thoughts drifted back to him, and a mixture of emotions washed over me. I knew even then that I was thinking about him more than I probably should. In the weeks that followed, Jalen's presence became more frequent, especially in the evenings when Aaron worked late. Our interactions, which had once been light-hearted and supportive, gradually became more profound. One afternoon, feeling overwhelmed by the widening gap between Aaron and me, I texted Jalen. True to form, he was there in no time, ready to listen and offer comfort. We sat together in the garden, our usual conversation flowing, but I sensed something different that night. There was a depth to Jalen's gaze that made me shiver, a gaze that was no longer that of a nephew, but that of a man. And in that look, I felt a spark, an awakening of feelings I had kept hidden for so long. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a line in the comments to let me know you're still with me. I tried to rationalize what I was feeling as merely the product of my loneliness, but the more I thought about it, the more I understood that something had shifted between us. At one point, as he reached down to pick up a fallen notebook, our hands briefly touched. The touch was fleeting, but it ignited a spark that was undeniable. Our eyes met, and in that silent exchange, I could see that he felt it too. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice filled with a mixture of concern and something deeper. I nodded, struggling to make sense of the intensity of the moment. We sat in silence until he finally spoke, breaking the spell. "Liana, this isn't right," he whispered, though I could see the same conflict in his eyes. I pulled my hand back, but even as I did, I knew these feelings were not ones I could easily put aside. The first real moment between us came one night when the tension between us was undeniable. We were talking as we often did, but this time there was an unmistakable change in the air. The conversation took on a more personal tone, and I felt we were crossing an invisible line. At one point, Jalen leaned over to pick up something he had dropped, and our hands touched again. But this time it wasn't a simple brush of fingers. His hand lingered, his fingers intertwined with mine, sending a shiver through my entire body. Our eyes met, and in that moment, the desire I had kept hidden surfaced, burning and undeniable. "I'm not sure what's happening, but I can't ignore it," I whispered, my voice shaking with the weight of what I was admitting. Jalen looked at me with a softness in his eyes and replied, "I don't know either, Liana, but maybe we can face it together." He wrapped me in a hug that spoke of warmth, comfort, and something deeper. As I held on to him, feeling the strength of his body against mine, I knew there was no turning back. The longing I had suppressed for so long had finally broken free. Our lips met in a kiss that began hesitantly, soft and searching, but as our emotions rose, it became intense, carrying with it the pent-up feelings we had both been hiding. In that moment, all thoughts of right and wrong seemed to disappear, and the only thing that mattered was the closeness we shared. After that first kiss, everything seemed to fall into an overwhelming silence, a moment suspended in time. Our hearts were racing. We both struggled to catch our breath as the weight of what had just happened settled in. We had crossed a line from which there was no return, and yet there was a strange sense of relief, a sense of fulfillment. I could feel his warmth pressing against me, our bodies still together. I felt his warmth press against me, our bodies still intertwined, but there was an underlying tension, a rush of emotion we could both barely comprehend. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice barely audible, shaking with the intensity of the feelings I was experiencing. I could still feel the heat of his lips on mine, and it made my heart race again just thinking about it. But there was also fear of what this meant for us, for the future. This moment was intense, but could we handle what came next? I was overwhelmed by the storm of emotions swirling around me. "I know, Liana," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity and vulnerability. "But I can't help it. I need to be close to you." There was something in his words that hit me hard, something deep and raw, and I realized how deeply he felt the same pull I did. Despite the crazy, overwhelming circumstances, he dared to speak his truth. Without saying anything else, I let myself be swept away by the moment. Every thought in my head seemed to disappear, and all I could focus on was him, his presence, his touch, the fire that was igniting between us. I embraced him again, letting the kiss become more intense, more urgent. The room seemed to get warmer, and the air was thick with passion, as if every inch of space between us was electrified. It was as if nothing else mattered at that moment. The outside world ceased to exist. It was just him and me, our emotions intertwined, our hearts beating as one. Before we knew it, we were on the bed, our bodies pressed together in an uncontrollable dance of passion. It wasn't just physical pleasure. It felt like something deeper was happening, an undeniable connection, a meeting of souls. The way our bodies fit together was as if we had always been meant to be together. In that moment, there was no fear, no hesitation, only surrender. Everything that had held us back before now felt distant, irrelevant. In the calm after the storm of passion, it felt as if we had finally found something we had both been searching for, something neither of us had realized we needed until it was right in front of us. That night, as we finally drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace, a deep, fulfilling peace that I hadn't felt in years. It was the kind of peace that makes you feel like everything is finally right, even if it's just for a fleeting moment. But even as I lay there, my body wrapped in his warmth, my mind was clouded by a deeper, darker thought. I knew that this happiness, this stolen happiness, came at a price. It was not a price we could easily pay, and the consequences of our actions could not be ignored. The doubts began to creep in, quietly at first, but growing louder as the night wore on. In the weeks that followed, we kept our relationship a secret, our meetings marked by an underlying sense of urgency and excitement. Each encounter felt like it could be the last, and the thrill of sneaking around added an adrenaline-fueled intensity to every touch, every kiss. We were careful, always careful, to leave no trace of our moments together. And yet each encounter left a mark on both of us, an indelible reminder of the forbidden love we were secretly nurturing. The secret itself was intoxicating, and it gave our time together a sense of urgency. But with that urgency came fear. Fear that we might be discovered, fear that the walls we had so carefully built around our secret might come crashing down at any moment. Yet we continued, unable to resist the magnetic pull between us. It was as if our souls were bound together by something too powerful to ignore, and each night we spent together was a brief, precious escape from the reality we had to face in the morning light. One night, as we lay in bed, the weight of our situation seemed heavier than ever. The quiet tension between us was palpable, and it felt as if something had changed. We were no longer just two people caught up in a moment of passion. Now we were on a path we weren't sure how to follow. Jayan turned to me, his eyes full of concern and something deeper, something like fear. "Liana, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're playing with fire and it's only a matter of time before we get burned. We have to be careful. We have to find a way to be together without risking everything." There was a seriousness in his voice, a weight to his words that I hadn't heard before. He wasn't just speaking out of concern for us, he was speaking out of a deep sense of fear that this could all come crashing down around us. His words hit me harder than I had expected. I knew that what he was saying was true. The risks we were taking were no longer abstract concepts. They were real, tangible risks that we couldn't ignore. I had always been the one to carry the burdens, to hold things together. But now I realized it was too much for me to carry alone. His gaze met mine, full of worry, but also something else, something that sparked a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling, the weight of his words settling heavily on my chest. "I can't be without you anymore. It's too late to go back. We've already gone too far, and I don't know if I could live with myself if I let this go." Jalen's expression softened, and he pulled me closer, wrapping his arms around me. "We can't afford to make mistakes," he said firmly, as if trying to convince us both that this was the only option left. "But maybe we can still be together if we're careful, if we take every step with caution. We have to be smart about this, Liana. We need to protect what we have." I nodded, my heart heavy but determined. We had crossed the line and there was no going back. The decision had been made. We would keep our relationship a secret, knowing the dangers, but unable to resist the bond that had grown between us. Every encounter would be a risk, but one we were both willing to take. We would live in the shadows, but we would live in each other's arms. The intensity of our love was undeniable, and neither of us was ready to let go, even if the consequences could destroy everything we held dear. So we made a pact, a silent agreement between the two of us. We would continue to see each other, continue to steal moments of happiness from the chaos of our lives, always cautious, always careful. We would keep the truth hidden, aware of the dangers, but unwilling to let go of the love that had consumed us. It was a dangerous game, but the only one we knew how to play. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. The days and nights that followed were filled with love and fear, passion and anxiety. Every moment we spent together was both a gift and a risk, and the tension never quite dissipated. But we kept going. Bound by something deeper than either of us could fully understand, every kiss, every touch was a silent promise to face the consequences together, whatever they might be. One night, as we were together in my room, a sound suddenly broke the silence, An unexpected noise from the living room. My heart skipped a beat, and in a flash of panic, I pulled Jalen into the closet, hoping to stay hidden, to protect us from whatever came next. Jalen's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and I could feel Jalen's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and I could feel him shaking beside me. It was as if the walls we had carefully built around us were now threatening to collapse. I could hear my breath quickening, the guilt of what we were doing washing over me like a tidal wave. "It's too risky," I whispered, my voice barely audible, thick with the weight of the situation. Jalen nodded, his voice trembling. "We have to be more careful," he said. His words hit me with the harsh truth of our reality. What we were doing couldn't continue without consequences. I agreed, feeling the weight of the truth settle in my chest. We had been lucky this time, but luck wouldn't protect us forever. We had to be smarter and more discreet. And yet the fear that had taken root in my heart only seemed to grow. Even as we stood there, hidden in the small, cramped room, I noticed something in Jalen's eyes. A flicker of doubt. He wasn't entirely convinced that the suspicions had been cleared. I knew deep down that no matter how careful we tried to be, the truth had a way of rising to the surface. It would be hard to completely escape the consequences of what we were doing. It wasn't just our actions. It was the guilt, the secrecy, and the way everything we touched seemed tainted by what we couldn't share with the world. 2 weeks had passed since that close call, and Jalen had become increasingly engrossed in his final exams. He was in the final stretch of his university career, with graduation looming on the horizon. His focus on his studies made him seem distant at times, but I knew he was under tremendous pressure. I, on the other hand, was sinking into a different kind of heaviness. I hadn't been feeling well for weeks, plagued by constant nausea that wouldn't go away. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just stress. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The emotional toll of everything we were doing, hiding, living in secret, had taken a physical toll on me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I tried not to think about it too much, but the truth was creeping closer and closer. One day, when Aaron returned from a project he had been working on, he suggested we go on a trip together to celebrate. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away from the tension of the past few weeks. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing discomfort in my stomach. I mentioned that I wasn't feeling well and needed to go to hospital. Concerned, Aaron immediately called a doctor to come to the house. The wait felt like an eternity, but when the doctor arrived, I had no idea how much my world was about to change in the next few hours. After a few tests, the doctor smiled, a warm, knowing look in his eyes. "Liana," he said gently, "you are 2 months pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. My mind went blank for a moment, the room spinning around me. Pregnant? The realization washed over me, but I couldn't quite process it. I had been careful, hadn't I? But no amount of thinking could change the truth. Aaron looked at me, stunned, his expression a mixture of confusion and surprise. He began to ask how this could have happened, how it was possible, given how long it had been since we had been intimate. I didn't have the answers. The weight of my actions, the choices I had made, weighed heavily on my chest. I agreed to go on the trip, hoping that a change of scenery would give me the space to think, to come to terms with what had happened. But when we returned home, I knew the time had come to explain everything. The guilt in my stomach grew as I prepared for what I had to say. When I finally sat down with Aaron and told him the truth, the whole painful truth, he listened in silence. When I finished, he stood up, his face unreadable, his fists clenched at his sides. He packed his bags without saying another word, cutting off contact with me completely. My heart broke as I watched him leave, the devastation of the situation overwhelming. I could barely breathe, suffocated by the guilt that had consumed me. I had destroyed the trust in our relationship, and the man I once loved walked away without looking back. But even as Aaron's absence weighed on me, I couldn't deny the conflicting emotions inside me. Amidst the guilt and devastation, I realized that my feelings for Jalen had only deepened. It wasn't just the passion or the physical connection, it was something more. There was an undeniable bond that had formed between us, one that grew stronger with each passing moment. And even though I knew I'd made mistakes, big mistakes, I couldn't ignore how much I cared for him. I wasn't ready to give that up. But there was something else, something I couldn't reconcile. I didn't dare tell Jalen what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to reveal the full extent of my actions, hoping that somehow, some way, he could finish his internship at the university in peace. I didn't want to burden him with the consequences of our choices. Now I find myself at a crossroads. I'm consumed by a storm of conflicting emotions, unable to make sense of what I've done or where this journey is taking me. I know I'm on a path I can't turn back from, but I'm not sure where it's going. The choices I've made have left me on the edge of something I'm not sure I can handle. And yet, there's no escaping the consequences of this tangled web I've woven. I stand here, torn between the love I've found with Jalen and the guilt that comes with it, questioning everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, and about the price we pay for our desires. And there you have it, a story full of complex emotions, choices, and the challenges of navigating relationships and self-discovery. Life often takes us on unexpected journeys, and this story reminds us of the delicate balance between desire, responsibility, and self-reflection. Now we want to hear from you. What did you learn from this story? Is there something about Liana's journey that resonates with you, or a particular insight that you found valuable? Comment below with one thing you've learned and how you might put it into practice in your own life. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below and don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.
The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the swimming pool, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. I was lying on a float, my eyes closed, the gentle lapping of the water soothing me as I basked in the sun. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Hey, kiddo," my stepfather called out, a teasing note in his voice. I opened my eyes to see him standing at the edge of the pool, his toned body glistening in the sunlight, a playful grin on his face. He was wearing tight swimming trunks that accentuated his physique, and I felt a flutter of excitement. "Hey, Dad, are you coming in?" I replied, tilting my head back and trying to keep my voice light, even though my heart was pounding. "Maybe I will," he said, a mischievous twinkle in his eyes, "but you'll have to catch me first." With that, he dove into the pool, the splash sending ripples across the surface. I couldn't help laughing, my excitement bubbling over as I kicked off my float and swam towards him. The cool water felt invigorating on my skin, the sun warming my back as I ran after him. He was surprisingly fast, gliding effortlessly through the water. "Think you can catch me?" he teased, looking back with a playful grin. "Just wait!" I shouted, determination fueling my strokes as I finally closed the gap between us. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm and pulling him closer. "Got you," he laughed, the sound rich and warm as he turned to face me. "All right, you win this time," he said, his voice softening as our faces hovered inches apart. The tension in the air shifted, electric and undeniable. I could feel his warmth radiating towards me, the intensity of his gaze locked onto mine. "You're getting better," he murmured, a hint of admiration in his tone. "Thanks, Dad. I've been practicing," I replied, my heart racing, and not just from swimming. He stepped closer, the water lapping around our legs, and the intimacy of the moment sent a chill through me. "You know," he said, his voice deep and soft, "I've always wanted to teach you to swim better." "Maybe we could train together more often," I suggested, my breath catching slightly as I felt the chemistry between us intensify. "Yes, I'd like that," he replied, his eyes flicking down to my lips for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "You've grown up so much." There was something deeper in his eyes now, a longing that stirred something in me. I took half a step closer, my pulse quickening. "I feel like I've missed out on time with you," I admitted. His expression softened, and he brushed a damp strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my skin. "I feel the same way." Before I could think, I leaned in slightly, and our lips brushed softly together, an innocent kiss that felt electrifying. It was tentative at first, but the moment was thick with tension, and when our mouths met again, the kiss deepened. I felt his hands find my waist and pull me closer, the warmth of his body lighting a fire inside me. When we finally drew back, both of us breathless, I searched his eyes for any sign of hesitation, but all I saw was desire reflected in his gaze. "What just happened?" I breathed, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty coursing through me. "I don't know," he admitted, stepping back slightly but keeping his hands on my waist, his thumbs brushing gently over my skin. "But I can't pretend it didn't feel amazing." I nodded, my heart racing. It did. There was an undeniable chemistry swirling around us, and I felt encouraged. Maybe we shouldn't fight it. He looked torn for a moment, but then he leaned closer, his breath warm against my cheek. "You really want this?" "More than anything," I whispered, feeling a surge of courage. "Let's not overthink it," he smiled, the warmth returning to his eyes. "All right then." He closed the distance between us and captured my lips in a passionate kiss that ignited every nerve in my body. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, the water swirling around us as we melted together. I wrapped my arms around his neck, deepening the kiss as I lost myself in the moment. Every touch sent sparks flying. Every caress ignited a desire I hadn't known was there. I felt alive, the thrill of the forbidden coursing through me as our kisses grew more urgent. When we broke the kiss, I looked up at him, breathless. "What if someone sees us?" "Let them," he murmured, his lips brushing against mine, igniting a new wave of longing. "I want you, and I'm tired of hiding it." His words sent a thrill through me, and I leaned in, capturing his lips again with more intensity. The world around us faded away, leaving only the two of us tangled in our own desires. His hand explored my body, pulling me closer as the water enveloped us. The heat of our connection contrasted with the coolness of the pool. "Do you really mean that?" I asked between kisses, my heart pounding. "Absolutely," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "I've wanted this for so long." Our kisses grew more heated, and I could feel a sense of urgency rising between us. I could feel the weight of our decisions, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. I pulled him closer, my body fitting perfectly against his as we moved in sync, lost in the whirlwind of emotions. As the sun sank lower, casting a warm glow around us, I whispered, "Let's not stop." He nodded, a fire in his eyes as he leaned in for another kiss. We both surrendered to the moment, the world outside fading away. I could feel the connection between us deepening, the passion igniting something new and exciting that I knew we could no longer ignore. This was just the beginning, and I was ready to explore whatever lay ahead with him by my side. As our lips met again, the world around us faded into a hazy background, consumed by the intensity of our connection. Each kiss was more urgent than the last, a desperate longing pouring from us as we explored this uncharted territory together. I could feel his heart racing beneath my fingertips as I ran my hands over his strong shoulders and down his arms. The sensation sent a wave of heat through me, igniting a fire that pulsed with every touch. The cool water enveloped us, a stark contrast to the warmth building between our bodies. "Let's go to the shallow end," I suggested breathlessly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want to feel closer to you." He nodded, his eyes dark with desire, and together we made our way to the edge of the pool, where the water was warmer and the air thick with anticipation. I climbed onto the edge of the pool, feeling the smooth tiles against my skin, and he followed, his body moving closer to mine. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice low as he slid next to me, our shoulders touching. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but the longing was undeniable. "It's more than okay," I replied, my heart racing. "I want this." With a hesitant smile, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face before leaning in again. This kiss was different, softer, yet charged with a simmering intensity. I melted into him, our lips moving in perfect harmony, a sweet rhythm that echoed the beating of our hearts. As the kiss deepened, I felt his hands on my waist, pulling me closer, the warmth radiating from him like a flame. I relished the sensation, my body responding instinctively to his touch. I felt brave, daring to lean into the moment as I wrapped my arms around his neck, feeling the strength in his arms as he held me close. "You feel so good," he murmured against my lips, his breath warm and inviting. I could feel the longing in his voice, a reflection of my own desires. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The words slipped out before I could hold them back, but there was no shame in this moment, only raw honesty. "Then let's not hold back," he said, his lips teasingly brushing against mine before capturing them again. The kiss ignited a spark that spread through me, overwhelming and intoxicating. I could feel his hands exploring my back, tracing the curves of my body, and I responded by pressing against him, my heart racing wildly. "Dad," I breathed, pulling back for a moment to catch my breath, the gravity of what we were doing hitting me. "Is this really okay?" "Shh," he whispered, his fingers gently stroking my cheek. "Just let it happen." With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, I surrendered to the moment and let my instincts guide me. I leaned in again, and our lips met with renewed passion. Each kiss felt like a promise, a declaration of our unspoken feelings. His hands moved lower, gripping my waist tightly as I tangled my fingers in his hair, losing myself in the sensation. The world outside faded away, leaving only us and the desire that crackled between us like electricity. "Ethan," he murmured between kisses, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected to feel this way about you." "Neither did I confessed, my heart racing as I leaned into him. "But it feels so right." The air grew thick with longing as I pressed my body against his, feeling the heat radiating between us. I could feel the urgency in his movements, and it sent shivers down my spine. Our kisses grew more heated, more desperate, a reflection of the passion that was building within us. As I pulled back slightly, my lips hovering just above his, I looked into his eyes. "What do we do now?" I whispered, my heart racing. "We take it one step at a time," he replied, his voice low and steady. "Together." With that, we leaned into each other again, our lips colliding as if the world outside had melted away. I felt as if we were enveloped in our own bubble, a place where nothing else mattered. Each kiss sent waves of warmth through me, igniting a desire I hadn't known was possible. Time seemed irrelevant as we lost ourselves in each other. I pulled him closer, feeling the warmth of his body against mine, a perfect fit as we surrendered to the moment. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and each kiss added fuel to the fire that raged inside of us. "Let's promise to keep this between us for now," he murmured against my lips, the weight of his words grounding me. "I promise," I whispered, my heart pounding with excitement and a touch of fear. I could feel the gravity of what we were doing, but the thrill of being so close to him, of exploring this new bond, was too tempting to resist. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the pool, we held each other, savoring the intimacy we had created. I felt safe in his arms, a sense of belonging enveloping me. "Whatever happens next, I'm here for you," he said softly, brushing his lips against my forehead. The tenderness of the gesture ignited a warmth within me. "I know," I replied, my heart swelling with affection. "And I'm here for you, too." It was then that I realized we were embarking on a journey together, one filled with uncertainty, but also with endless possibilities. With him by my side, I felt a sense of hope and excitement for what lay ahead. A thrilling adventure waiting just below the surface.
Hey, my name is Sarah, and this story is, well, let's just say it's not one I thought I'd ever tell, but it's too wild to keep to myself. And maybe there's a lesson in it, so here goes. Joshua and I met in college, and we'd been together for almost a decade. We were the couple everyone thought was perfect, always laughing, always telling stories. But somewhere in the middle of raising our 2 kids and managing our busy lives, things started to feel stale. Maybe some of you know this feeling, the slow drift into routine, the way little moments of connection seem to fade over time. One night we were having dinner, just the 2 of us, when Joshua brought up a rather surprising idea. He began by saying that he felt we weren't connecting as we used to, and suggested we try something out of the ordinary. At first I was a bit thrown. He was talking about inviting new people into our social lives, not in an intimate way, but just as friends to spice up our meetings and conversations. I was cautious but agreed, thinking it might be a harmless way to add some variety to our social lives. The following week we went to a party a friend of his was throwing. Joshua had invited a few new faces, including these 3 guys he'd met recently. They were friendly, respectful, and honestly a lot of fun to be around. There was Thomas, who was a huge basketball fan, Aaron, the tech-savvy guy who always had an interesting story to tell, and Isaiah, who had the warmest, most easygoing personality of the bunch. Over the next few weeks, we began to meet regularly as a group. Joshua seemed genuinely happy with the new dynamic. But something surprising began to happen. I found myself enjoying the company of our new friends and noticed that they were paying quite a bit of attention to me. Nothing inappropriate, just a little extra kindness, a few compliments, and a lot of laughter. For the first time in ages, I felt a small thrill of being noticed and admired. One night, Joshua and I were walking home after one of these meetings, and he surprised me with a question that knocked me over. He asked if I had any special connections with our new friends, saying he'd noticed how well we all got along. I played it off and tried to laugh it off, but he pressed on, suggesting that maybe a little harmless flirtation wouldn't be the worst thing for our marriage. This conversation led us into a new, unfamiliar territory, talking openly about our feelings, even the ones we usually keep to ourselves. It was strange, maybe even a little uncomfortable, but it was also exciting. I felt we were breaking through something, reaching a new level of honesty. Joshua admitted that he felt a mixture of excitement and curiosity watching me interact with others, and I shared that yes, it was nice to feel noticed again. We soon developed a sort of agreement. We decided to give each other a bit of freedom in these friendships, knowing that it was all for the thrill of bringing something new into our marriage. There was no plan for anything more, no overstepping of boundaries. We both agreed on that. It was just about keeping the spark alive. A week later, Joshua suggested we have a little get-together at our house. We invited Thomas, Aaron, and Isaiah, and it turned out to be a really nice evening. The boys brought food, we shared drinks, and for the first time I felt totally relaxed in their company. Joshua was in his element, playing host and encouraging everyone to have a good time. It was like we were in some kind of social experiment, except it felt surprisingly real. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself in a small circle with Thomas, Aaron, and Isaiah. We talked about everything, our backgrounds, funny childhood stories, and even a bit about relationships. They made me laugh harder than I had in years, and for a moment, I almost forgot the situation I was in. It was just fun. Joshua was nearby, smiling and encouraging me to enjoy the conversation. Then, out of nowhere, Aaron made a playful remark about how he couldn't believe a woman like me was even real. It was flattering, but I immediately laughed it off, not thinking much of it. But when I looked over at Joshua, I saw him nod, almost as if he agreed with the sentiment. That tiny moment of eye contact said it all. He was totally on board. After everyone had left, Joshua and I sat down, and he admitted that seeing me connect with other people like that made him feel closer to me. It sounds strange, I know, but in that unusual way, it brought us back to the connection we'd once had. It was as if we were sharing a private secret in a very public space, something only we fully understood. I felt closer to Joshua that night than I had in a long time. But things took a turn after that night. We started inviting the boys over more often, and I soon realized that Joshua was pushing the boundaries of this exciting experiment. He'd encouraged me to talk to them more, to spend more time in their company. It was confusing. I couldn't understand if he was really enjoying it or if he was just trying to bring some excitement into our lives. One evening, after Thomas, Aaron, and Isaiah had left, Joshua suggested we play a game, something silly and light-hearted. But somehow, as the game went on, it began to feel more like a test of boundaries. Nothing serious happened, but the energy in the room shifted. I noticed the boys exchanging glances, and I began to feel uneasy, as if the game was going somewhere I hadn't agreed to. Joshua must have sensed my discomfort because he quickly suggested we change the subject. The rest of the evening was spent watching a film, and thankfully the mood eased. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that this experiment was taking on a life of its own, going beyond what I was comfortable with. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. Joshua's curiosity had set something in motion over which neither of us seemed to have complete control. Part of me liked the attention and excitement. It was something I hadn't felt in years. But another part of me feared that we were entering dangerous territory. Joshua noticed my hesitation and reassured me that we could always stop. But every time we talked about it, he'd end up encouraging me to have fun and let go. He even admitted that he liked seeing me happy in a way that he hadn't seen in a long time. This constant push and pull between curiosity and caution left me in an emotional whirlwind. Then came the night that changed everything. Joshua and I decided to have a barbecue in the garden and invited Thomas, Aaron, and Isaiah. We barbecued, laughed, and shared stories as usual. As the evening wore on, the boys began to talk about their lives, their families, and the things that mattered most to them. It was a heart-to-heart, the kind that makes you feel like you've known someone for years. At one point, Joshua pulled me aside and whispered, "Look how comfortable you are around them. You're glowing." I smiled, a little nervous but also unsure of what he was implying. He leaned forward and said, "Why don't you spend a moment with them? Just chat, get to know them better." I was nervous but agreed, thinking it was just another friendly moment. So I found myself in the corner of the yard with Thomas, Aaron, and Isaiah. We talked about everything under the stars, from personal dreams to places we wanted to travel to. Each of them had such a unique perspective on life, and it was refreshing to hear. Out of the blue, Thomas started talking about relationships, mentioning how important honesty was to him. Aaron agreed, sharing that loyalty was one of his top values. And Isaiah, always the quiet, wise one, added that trust was the foundation of any strong relationship. Their words resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. It was as if they were describing exactly what I felt was missing in my marriage, but hadn't fully acknowledged until then. As the evening drew to a close, the boys began to gather their things to leave. I found myself standing by the gate with them, feeling strangely sentimental. Thomas looked at me and said, "Thank you for tonight, Sarah. You and Joshua, you two have something very special." Aaron nodded and added, "It's not often you see couples who trust each other so much." Isaiah gave me a warm smile and said, "Take care, Sarah." Their words stayed with me long after they left. I went back inside to find Joshua waiting, looking at me with a strange intensity. I didn't know what he was thinking, but something had clearly changed between us. He asked me if I'd enjoyed the evening, and I told him the truth. I had. There was something liberating about the experience, even though nothing inappropriate had happened. But Joshua wasn't satisfied. He pressed on, asking if I'd felt anything special with any of them. His question took me by surprise. I hesitated, as if he wanted me to admit something that wasn't there. I told him that while I enjoyed their company, I had no desire to cross any boundaries. But his insistence made me uneasy. Over the next few days, Joshua's curiosity turned into something more intense. He asked me detailed questions about my interactions with the boys, replaying moments I'd almost forgotten. At first, I thought he was just fascinated by the thrill of our little social experiment, but it soon became clear that he was looking for something more, as if he wanted me to feel things I wasn't. Finally, one evening, I confronted him. I asked him why he was pushing so hard, why he kept nudging me to explore connections that were clearly only platonic. His answer surprised me. He admitted that he felt inadequate, that he wasn't enough to make me happy anymore. He confessed that he thought bringing other people into our lives might spice things up and rekindle something in me that he feared he couldn't provide. It was a heartbreaking moment to see the uncertainty in his eyes. For years I had thought Joshua was the confident one, the rock of our marriage. But here he was, vulnerable and looking for answers in all the wrong places. I told him not to worry, that the happiness I'd felt was because of us, not because of anyone else. In that conversation, we found ourselves reconnecting in a way we hadn't for years. We acknowledged the cracks in our relationship and faced the unspoken fears we both had. We realized that it wasn't the presence of others that would fix our marriage, but the courage to face our own insecurities and make space for each other again. And so we made a pact. We agreed to stop the experiment and concentrate on rebuilding what we'd lost. We spent more time together, getting to know each other's quirks and desires, and rediscovering the love that had brought us together in the first place. We didn't need anyone else to make us feel alive. We just needed to remember why we fell in love in the first place. It wasn't an easy journey and it took time, but we came out stronger, with a deeper understanding of each other's needs and insecurities. The experience taught us both that sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that bring you closest. I never imagined my life would be like this at the age of 72. I was just a typical widow, abandoned and alone, with a peaceful house and more time than I knew what to do with. After Tom died, people said I would get used to the loneliness, but the years passed and the silence remained. That's when he came into my life, Charlie, my dog, my comfort and my companion. And as it turned out, it began like any relationship between a pet and its owner. My daughter Sarah practically begged me to get a dog from the shelter, saying, "It'll keep you company, Mum," not realizing the company I'd be keeping. At first, Charlie was just a dog, albeit a particularly attentive one who seemed to know when I was feeling down, nudging my hand with his cold nose and wagging his tail to cheer me up. I used to talk to him a lot, and I assumed that was normal, because who wouldn't talk to a dog when no one else was around? But I can still remember the night when I first felt something had changed. It was the anniversary of Tom's death, and I was tired of crying. Charlie was by my side as usual, but this time he didn't just sit there. Instead, he crawled onto the couch and laid his head on my lap, his eyes locked with mine, as if he could feel the depth of my grief, as if he understood. "You're a good boy, Charlie." I silently stroked his soft ears, feeling my grief ease just by being around him. I remember thinking that he understood me better than anyone else because of the way he looked at me. It wasn't the typical way a dog looks at its owner. There was something deeper, almost human in those eyes. As the months went by, Charlie became more than just a friend. I'd wake up every morning to find him curled up on the edge of the bed where Tom used to sleep. His place was now taken by my dog. I didn't mind, of course. In fact, it became something I looked forward to. That warm body next to mine, breathing softly in the night, made me feel less alone. But it wasn't just his warmth that made me feel different. It was the way he began to follow me everywhere, like a shadow. More than that, he began to watch me with an intensity that at first unsettled me. Whenever I moved, his eyes were on me, always waiting, always expecting. It wasn't long before I began to feel a strange connection growing between us, something I couldn't quite explain. There was one evening, however, that stood out more than the others. It was late and the house was quiet. I had finished my tea and was heading for bed when Charlie trotted into the bedroom behind me, as he often did. But this time, instead of sitting at the foot of the bed, he sat down next to me on the mattress. His big dark eyes bored into mine. I felt a strange flutter in my chest. "Charlie, what are you doing?" I asked, laughing softly to break the tension I suddenly felt. But he didn't move. He just sat there, staring. Something about the way he looked at me made me stop. The desire in his eyes made my heart race, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I knew it was ridiculous, but there was a moment, a brief moment, when I could have sworn I saw something in him, something beyond what was normal for a dog. As if sensing the confusion in my head, Charlie nudged closer and rested his head on my thigh. His tail was wagging gently, but the moment was charged with something I didn't understand. I reached down to stroke him, my fingers trembling slightly, and then I felt it. A warmth, a connection, something I hadn't felt in years, not since Tom. From that night on, things only got stranger. Charlie became even more attached, always finding ways to be near me. I couldn't move without him being there, watching and waiting. He began to sit closer during our nights on the couch, his body pressed against mine in a way that felt more intimate than it should. It was comforting, yes, but there was something else, something unsettling, that I couldn't admit to myself at first. I remember waking up one night to the moonlight casting shadows across the room. I turned over in bed, and there he was, Charlie, lying right next to me. I should have been shocked to see his face so close I could feel his breath, but instead I felt a rush of warmth. He nuzzled closer when I reached out and brushed his fur, and I felt the unmistakable realization that my bond with him had deepened into something I couldn't easily explain. I tried to push the thought from my mind, telling myself it was just loneliness playing tricks on me, being an elderly woman who had lost the love of her life. Was it wrong to seek comfort even from a dog? But the feelings only grew stronger. Charlie seemed to feel it too, because he was always by my side, accompanying me everywhere. His eyes never left mine. It was as if we were two creatures drawn together by an invisible force that transcended the boundaries of friendship. I couldn't deny it any longer. I needed him more than I cared to admit. Then came the night that changed my life forever. I went downstairs, hoping a glass of water would help me relax, because I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was developing between us. But when I got back to the bedroom, Charlie was already there, lying on my side of the bed. He didn't even blink when I walked over to him. Instead, he just stared at me, waiting, as if he had been expecting me. At first, I was afraid to get into bed, but as soon as I was under the covers, Charlie moved closer, rubbing his body against mine in a way that seemed so intimate that I felt my breath catch in my throat. But instead of pushing him away, I let him stay. His warmth seeped into me, filling the cold places in my heart that had been empty for so long. I should have been ashamed, but I wasn't. In that moment, lying there with Charlie beside me, I felt a strange peace, a peace I hadn't felt since Tom's death. It was wrong, I knew, but it also felt right in a way I couldn't explain. We stayed like that for a long time, just lying there in the dark, two lonely souls finding comfort in each other. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line. What was happening between Charlie and me was more than just companionship, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself. I needed him. He had filled a void that I hadn't realized was so deep. But as the weeks went by, I began to realize that this strange emotional affair with my dog wasn't healthy. I had let my loneliness spiral out of control, and now I was caught up in something I didn't fully understand. I knew it had to stop. I had to face the truth. It wasn't easy to admit, but the fact was staring me in the face. I had to get out of this unhealthy relationship before it consumed me completely. I was looking for something in Charlie that I should have been looking for in my family and friends. Charlie was a great, devoted dog, but he wasn't the answer to my loneliness because he couldn't fill the void left by Tom. As a result, I gradually began to distance myself from him, spending more time with Sarah and the grandchildren, catching up with old acquaintances and trying to work out how I could continue to do the things I used to love. Of course, Charlie was always by my side, but I was careful to set limits. I had to remind myself that he was just my dog, not my partner. Looking back, I can see how easily loneliness can lead to strange and unexpected places. I had allowed my grief to cloud my judgment, leading to an unhealthy attachment. But I eventually found my way back. I discovered that no matter how much I loved Charlie, he could never replace the connections I needed with other people. So here I am, sitting in my peaceful home with Charlie at my feet, as he always does. I wish I could say that everything went back to normal after I decided to set boundaries with Charlie, but the reality is that it has been a slow and challenging process. There were times when I doubted myself because the quiet evenings felt too overwhelming, and I found myself relying on Charlie's familiar presence. But I reminded myself every day that it wasn't healthy, that it wasn't fair to Charlie or to me. He was a dog, a creature that gave unconditional love, but he couldn't replace the human connection that I desperately needed. I found myself seeking more interaction with people. My daughter Sarah was the first to notice the change. "Mum, you've been coming over more often lately," she said one afternoon when I dropped in for tea. There was a warmth in her voice that I hadn't heard in a long time, and I realized that my withdrawal from people had made them feel the distance too. "I just don't want to be alone so much," I admitted, not quite ready to tell her the full extent of my strange relationship with Charlie. How could I? I was embarrassed. Sarah had always been practical, the kind of person who would never understand how deep my loneliness had gone. "Well, we're always here for you, Mum. You know that," she said with a smile. Her words were comforting, but there was also a pang of regret in my chest. Why hadn't I come to her before? Why had I allowed my grief and isolation to push me into such a strange emotional bond with a dog instead of my own family? As time went on, I made more of an effort to reconnect with the world outside my small home. I joined a book club at the local library, something I hadn't done for years. At first, it was difficult to sit there and chat with the other women, all of whom were talking about their children, grandchildren, and their busy lives full of people. I felt out of place, as if my years of solitude had made me forget how to connect with others. But gradually, I found myself enjoying their company. We discussed novels over cups of tea, laughing at plot twists and characters that reminded us of people we knew. It felt good to laugh again, to feel the lightness in my chest that had been missing for so long. Through it all, Charlie remained my constant companion, but I was more aware of the boundaries I had to maintain. I no longer let him sleep in my bed, a habit I had come to rely on during my darkest days. Instead, I would give him a gentle pat on the head before bedtime, and he would settle into his own cozy bed at my feet. It was hard at first to resist the urge to pull him close and let his warmth comfort me as it had before, but I knew I had to stand firm. As the months went by, I began to notice a change in myself. I was no longer consumed by the overwhelming loneliness that had driven me to seek solace in Charlie. My heart still ached for Tom, as I had always suspected it would, but I was beginning to accept that loneliness and grief were a natural part of life and didn't define me. About a year after that strange turning point with Charlie, I took him for a walk in the park. The leaves crunched under our feet, the air was cool, and the scent of pine filled the breeze. As I looked around, I noticed other people walking their dogs, some laughing and chatting with friends. It struck me how easy it could be to just enjoy the moment and the companionship of both humans and animals. Charlie stopped to sniff a fallen leaf, his tail wagging contentedly, and I smiled down at him. "You've been a good dog, haven't you?" I said quietly, scratching his ears. He looked up at me, those big brown eyes filled with the same love and loyalty he had always shown, but now I saw it for what it was. Pure, simple, and unconditional, but not something to fill the void that human relationships are meant to fill. In the months that followed, I found myself opening up more and more. I let my family in and told them about the struggles I had faced and the loneliness that had consumed me after Tom's death. I even told Sarah, in a roundabout way, how much I had come to rely on Charlie. She listened quietly, her face filled with understanding. When I finished, she gave me a big hug. "You don't have to do this alone, Mum," she said, her voice soft. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. I didn't have to do this alone. I had people who loved me, who wanted to help me through my grief. And although Charlie had been an important part of that journey, I now understood that he couldn't be my everything. He was my dog, my loyal companion, but I had to learn to lean on the people in my life again. Looking back, I can see how easy it is to let loneliness take you to strange places and form relationships that make no sense to anyone else. But in the end, it is the human connections that matter most, the love and support of family and friends. Sitting here with Charlie curled up at my feet, I feel at peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding loneliness through strange attachments, but the kind that comes from facing your feelings and reconnecting with the people who matter most. After all, it's the love we share with others that truly heals us, not the temporary comfort of solitude or the influence of a dog, however devoted. Charlie will always have a special place in my heart, but I'm learning to embrace the world outside my quiet home again. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but life has a strange way of unraveling, doesn't it? My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how I caught my mother in the act, and how everything spiraled out of control after that. It all began on a warm Sunday afternoon. My parents had been married for almost 30 years, and while they weren't the most romantic couple, I always believed they were happy. My father was a quiet man, more focused on his work than his emotions, and my mother, well, she was the kind of woman who thrived on attention, but never did I imagine that her need for attention would lead to something like this. John had been around our family for as long as I could remember. He was my father's best friend, a charming, charismatic man who seemed to have it all together. He was always there for my dad, always the guy to give advice, help fix things, or be a shoulder to lean on. I had grown up seeing him as a part of the family, but things started to change when I noticed how often John came over, even when my father wasn't around. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was like an uncle to me, and I assumed he was just helping my mum with errands or offering support while Dad was away on business. But there was something in the air that didn't sit right with me. The way they laughed at each other's jokes a little too hard. The way my mother's eyes lit up when John walked into the room. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. After all, it was John, my father's best friend. There was no way anything inappropriate could be happening, right? One afternoon, everything changed. I had come home from work earlier than expected. I remember feeling uneasy as I walked through the front door, a strange tension in the air. My mum hadn't mentioned that John was coming over that day, but as soon as I heard voices coming from the kitchen, my stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. As I crept down the hallway, their hushed whispers grew louder. My heart was pounding, and I was torn between turning around and leaving or facing what I feared. The moment I turned the corner and saw them standing far too close, my mother's hand gently caressing John's arm, I froze. It wasn't an intimate act, but it was enough. Enough to make my blood boil, enough to confirm the worst thoughts that had been swirling in my head for weeks. They hadn't seen me yet. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching their conversation grow more intense. John leaned closer, his hand resting on the small of my mother's back. Her face was flushed, her breathing rapid, and for a split second I thought they might... No, I couldn't watch any longer. "Mum!" My voice cracked, and they both jumped back as if burned. The guilt on my mother's face was undeniable. She stammered something incoherent and backed away from John as if that would erase what had just happened. John looked horrified too, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of defiance perhaps, as if he wasn't sorry at all. "Rachel, it's not what it looks like," my mum blurted out, her voice shaking. But I wasn't buying it. "Please, just let me explain." I wanted to shout. I wanted to shout at her, at John, at the whole situation, but I couldn't. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, a million thoughts running through my head. How long had this been going on? What would my dad think? And most importantly, how could she betray him like this? "Explain what, Mum?" I finally managed to say, my voice icy. "What exactly is there to explain?" John started to speak, but I cut him off with a glare. I couldn't even look at him without feeling sick. This man, who had been like family to me, had crossed a line that could never be crossed again. And my mother, my own mother, had let it happen. "It shouldn't have happened," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "It's just, your father and we've been distant for so long. I never meant for it to come to this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was she really trying to justify this? Did she think her loneliness excused what she had done? I felt my world shattering around me, the solid foundation of trust I had always had in my family crumbling to dust. "And John," I spat his name like it was poison. "What about him? What does he have to say for himself?" John, to his credit, didn't try to make excuses. He simply stood there, looking guilty and ashamed, but somehow still arrogant. It made me hate him even more. "I made a mistake, Rachel," he said quietly. "A huge mistake. I care about your family and I never meant to hurt anyone." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. A mistake? This wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, and no amount of apologies could fix it. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, leaving them both standing there in stunned silence. I couldn't deal with it. I needed time to think, to process what I had just witnessed. How could my mother do this to my father? How could John, someone I had trusted all my life, have been a part of this? I spent the next few hours driving around aimlessly, trying to make sense of the situation. I knew I couldn't keep this a secret from my father, but at the same time, I wasn't prepared to destroy our family. I didn't want to be the one to tear it all apart, but how could I look my father in the eye, knowing what I knew? My phone buzzed on the seat next to me, and I glanced down to see a text from my mum. "Please come home, we need to talk." I wasn't ready to talk, not yet, but I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, I would have to face them both and decide what to do next. But as I pulled over to the side of the road and stared blankly out of the window, one thing became painfully clear. Things would never be the same. I stayed in the car for hours, the weight of what I had just discovered pressing down on me like a heavy cloud. My head was spinning, but I knew I couldn't stay out forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to go home and face my mother and John. I thought about what to do next. Telling my dad seemed like the right thing to do, but I wasn't sure how to break the news without destroying him. My parents had built a life together, years of shared memories, struggles, and love. I knew that what I had seen could destroy all that. As the sun went down, I finally got up the courage to go home. When I walked through the door, my mother was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me with a mixture of guilt and fear, but I had no sympathy to offer her. Not yet. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice small and shaky. "Yes, we do," I replied coldly, my emotions still a mess. I sat down across from her, keeping my distance. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was suffocating, but I didn't want to break it first. Finally, she took a deep breath and began. "I never wanted you to find out like this, Rachel. I never wanted you to find out at all." "That's comforting," I said sarcastically. "So you were just going to keep sneaking around behind Dad's back? How long has that been going on?" She winced at the harshness of my words, but didn't try to defend herself. "It's complicated. It started a few months ago. I never meant for it to become anything serious. I was just lonely and John was there." "Lonely?" I repeated, disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. That's your excuse? You were lonely, so you turned to Dad's best friend. Do you have any idea what that will do to him? Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I know I've hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. I know I hurt your father too. I don't know how to make it right. I stood up, unable to sit still. You can't fix it, Mum. You've broken something that can't be fixed. She sobbed softly into her hands, but I didn't move to comfort her. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. Just as I was about to leave the room, the front door swung open and my father walked in. He smiled when he saw us, oblivious to the storm brewing in our living room. "Hey, girls," he said cheerfully. "What's going on?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment when everything came crashing down. My mother and I exchanged glances, both of us knowing there was no easy way out. "I need to talk to you," I blurted out, my voice shaking, "about something important." He looked worried and put down his briefcase, sensing the tension in the room. "What is it? Is everything all right?" I hesitated. How could I tell him? How could I break the trust he had in the two people he loved most? But before I could say anything, my mother stood up and wiped away her tears. "I have something to tell you," she said quietly as she stepped forward. My father's eyes darted between us, confused. "Carol, what's going on?" he asked, his tone suspicious. I made a terrible mistake," she whispered, "something I never thought I'd do." My father frowned, but still didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" She looked at him, her eyes full of regret and pain. "It's John. He and I, we crossed a line." There was a deafening silence in the room. My father's face grew pale as her words slowly sank in. For a moment it seemed he hadn't heard her correctly, but then the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, but there was an edge of disbelief that quickly turned to anger. "I'm so sorry," my mother choked out, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" My father's voice rose, raw anger flashing in his eyes. "You betrayed me with my best friend and you call it a mistake?" I could feel the tension in the air, my father's devastation palpable. I had never seen him like this, so broken, so hurt. The man who had always been my rock looked as if his whole world had collapsed around him. "How long?" he demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. "How long has this been going on?" My mother sobbed uncontrollably, unable to speak. I couldn't stand to watch any longer, so I stepped in. "Dad, I found out today," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "It's been going on for a couple of months." He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. I could see the pain in his eyes, but there was something else: betrayal, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. The woman he had loved for decades had betrayed him, and so had the man he had called his best friend. "I can't believe it," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. "I never thought... Carol, how could you..." "I'm sorry," she cried. "I never meant to hurt you. I just felt so alone." "And you think that makes it okay?" he shouted, his voice full of bitterness. "You think that justifies this?" "I know it doesn't," she whispered, her tears falling faster. "I've ruined everything." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was unbearable, the weight of what had just been revealed hanging over us like a dark cloud. My father stared at my mother, the woman he had trusted with his heart, and I could see the devastation written all over his face. "I've got to get out of here," he finally said, his voice hoarse. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. My mother collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, numb, unsure of what to do next. Everything I had known about my family, about the people I loved, had been torn apart in a matter of hours. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," my mum whispered through her tears. "I never wanted this to happen." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to comfort her, or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. As I sat down on the couch, staring at the door my father had just stormed through, I wondered how we would ever move forward from this. It's been a year since Michael, my husband, passed away. A sudden stroke had taken him from us, leaving a void in our lives that seemed impossible to fill. He was not only my husband, but my rock, my partner, and the glue that held our little family together. My son Ethan has stepped up in ways I never imagined. At only 24, he had a maturity beyond his years. He put his own grief aside to care for me, always making sure I wasn't alone in my grief. Ethan had always been a kind and thoughtful son, but after his father's death, he became my lifeline. This morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen with something tucked behind his back and a mischievous smile on his face. "Good morning, Mum," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "I have a surprise for you." "A surprise?" I asked, raising a curious eyebrow. "Come outside," he urged, his excitement infectious. I followed him to the driveway, the early sunlight bouncing off the sleek silver paint of a car I recognized immediately. "Oh my goodness," I gasped. My dream car, a convertible I'd always admired but never allowed myself to want, was parked there, gleaming in the morning light. "Do you like it?" he asked, grinning from ear to ear. "Like it, Ethan? It's beautiful, but how did you—" "It's yours, Mum. You've done so much for me, for us. You deserve this." His eyes softened, a hint of vulnerability breaking through his confident exterior. "I know you felt trapped at home. I thought this might bring some joy back." I felt tears prick my eyes. "Ethan, I don't even know what to say. This is too much." "No, it's not," he said firmly. "You've always sacrificed for everyone else. It's time you did something for yourself." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I threw my arms around him, holding him tight. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "It means the world to me." That evening, we took the car out for a drive, the top down, the wind blowing through our hair. We laughed as we sped along familiar roads, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in months, I felt a lightness in my heart. Ethan hadn't just given me a car, he had given me a reminder of what it was like to live, to embrace the beauty of the world outside my grief. His love and care made the impossible seem possible again. As we pulled back into the driveway, Ethan turned to me with a serious look on his face. "Mum, I know you're struggling. I can't bring Dad back, but I'll always be here for you. You're not alone." And I believed him, for in Ethan's unwavering love and support, I found the strength to carry on, carrying the memories of my husband and the promise of better days ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan continued to show me a side of himself I'd never fully appreciated. It wasn't just the grand gesture of the car, it was the little things he did every day that reminded me that I wasn't facing life's challenges alone. It started with small moments. When I stumbled into the kitchen one morning, blurry-eyed and not quite ready to face the day, Ethan was there, apron in hand, cooking breakfast. "I thought you could use a break from cooking," he said wryly, setting a plate of perfectly fluffy pancakes in front of me. "You spoil me, Ethan," I said, laughing softly, but deep down his thoughtfulness warmed my heart. "You deserve to be spoiled, Mum," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "You've done so much for me. Let me look after you for once." It wasn't just breakfast either. Ethan was always one step ahead, finding ways to make my days a little brighter. When I couldn't bring myself to clean out the attic where so many of Michael's things were stored, Ethan quietly took on the task. He didn't pressure me to go through anything, just made sure it was organized and ready when I was ready. One rainy afternoon, I found him in the living room, carefully arranging flowers in a vase. I stopped and watched him for a moment. "Flowers?" I asked, tilting my head. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," he said, looking up with a small smile. I just thought the house could use some color, and I know you love lilies. My chest tightened at his thoughtfulness. Michael had always brought me flowers for no reason, and Ethan must have remembered. You're different, you know that? I try, he said, flashing me his trademark grin. But it wasn't just the thoughtful gesture. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the most important person in his world. Ethan had a way of noticing even the smallest changes in my mood. If he saw me staring out of the window for too long, lost in thought, he'd bring me a cup of tea and sit beside me in comfortable silence. If he caught me sighing over a heavy task, he'd jump in and take over, telling me to rest. You don't have to do everything yourself, Mum, he kept reminding me. I'm here. One evening, as we sat on the veranda watching the sun sink below the horizon, Ethan turned to me with a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, you're amazing, he said, his tone sincere. Where does that come from? I asked, smiling at him. It's the truth, he said with a shrug. You've always been so strong, even when things have fallen apart. I don't know how you do it. I looked away, the emotion of his words threatening to overwhelm me. I'm not as strong as you think I am, I admitted. Sometimes I feel like I'm barely holding it together. Ethan reached over and put a hand over mine. You don't have to keep it together all the time. It's okay to lean on me. That's what family is for. I squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words. He had a way of making me feel seen, as if he understood the depth of my grief and the weight I carried every day. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's unwavering support became my anchor. He encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone and pushed me to embrace life again. He signed us up for a cooking class, saying it would be something fun we could do together. I was reluctant at first, but his enthusiasm was infectious. In the class, I found myself laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. Ethan was terrible at following recipes and often went rogue with the ingredients, but his playful attitude kept the mood light. When our soufflé collapsed spectacularly, he turned to me with an exaggerated look of despair. Well, we may not win any prizes, but at least we'll have a good story, he said, making me laugh until my sides hurt. Ethan's compliments also always surprised me. He had a way of making me feel valued and appreciated in a way I hadn't felt since Michael died. One night, as I was getting ready for dinner with an old friend, Ethan stopped in his tracks when he saw me in a dress I hadn't worn in years. Wow, Mum, he said, his eyes wide. You look stunning. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. Oh, stop it, I said, waving him off. It's just an old dress. No, seriously, he insisted. You look beautiful. His words stayed with me all night, a little boost of confidence I hadn't realized I needed. Beyond the compliments and concern, Ethan became my partner in rediscovering joy. He surprised me one weekend by planning a day trip to a nearby vineyard, knowing how much I love wine tasting. We strolled through the vineyards, sampling different blends and laughing at our less than sophisticated descriptions of the flavors. You have a good palate, Ethan said, teasing me. I think we've found your calling. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. Don't quit your day job, wine critic. The days we spent together were healing in ways I hadn't expected. Ethan's unwavering love and support reminded me that even in the face of loss, life has its moments of beauty and connection. In those moments, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again, not despite the pain, but because of the love that surrounded me. That evening, the wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and promising a storm. I was in the kitchen doing the dishes when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Ethan, I called, my voice cutting through the sudden silence. I'm here, he replied from the living room, the sound of his voice immediately reassuring. A moment later, I heard his footsteps approaching, and his silhouette appeared in the doorway, torch in hand. Looks like the storm knocked out the power, he said, shining the light around the room. Well, this is cozy, I said with a soft laugh, drying my hands on a towel. At least we have flashlights. Ethan grinned. You know, this reminds me of when I was a kid. Remember those blackouts we used to have in the winter? How could I forget? I said, a nostalgic smile spreading across my face. You used to beg me to play games with you to pass the time. Exactly, he said, his grin turning mischievous. So why not now? I raised an eyebrow at him. What do you mean? Hide and seek, he said, his eyes twinkling in the dim light. Come on, just like old times. It'll be fun. Hide and seek, I echoed, laughing. Ethan, we're not kids anymore. Doesn't mean we can't act like it for a night, he countered, his tone playful. Unless you're afraid I'll find you too easily. That was enough. I could never resist a good challenge, and Ethan knew that. Fine, I said, crossing my arms, but don't think for a second that I'm going to make it easy for you. He chuckled, counting down from 10 as I grabbed the torch and darted into the darkened hallway. The house was filled with familiar shadows, made eerie by the storm outside. I found a spot behind the couch in the study, crouched down and tried to steady my breathing. Ready or not, here I come, Ethan's voice echoed through the house, and I couldn't help but smile at how ridiculous this all was. But it felt good, freeing, to let go and enjoy a moment of light-hearted fun. I could hear his footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, as if enjoying the hunt. You know, Mum, he called out, his voice teasing, you'll have to do better than that if you want to stay hidden. I put a hand over my mouth to stifle a laugh. His shadow passed the entrance to the cave, and I held my breath. Just as I thought he might move on, he turned and looked into the room with a triumphant smile. Found you, he said, shining the torch directly at me. Ugh, you're too good at this, I said, laughing as I stood up. Years of practice, he replied smugly. Now it's your turn to find me. We switched places, and I spent the next few minutes looking for him. I couldn't believe how agile and quick he was, slipping from one hiding place to the next before I could catch up. It wasn't until I stumbled into the spare bedroom and opened the wardrobe that I found him crouched in the corner with a sheepish grin. Got you, I said, breathless and laughing. All right, he conceded, standing up and raising his hands in mock surrender. I admit defeat. We both collapsed onto the sofa in the living room, our laughter echoing through the dim, silent house. The storm raged on outside, but inside the warmth between us was undeniable. It felt like we'd stepped back in time, to a time when life was simpler and our bond was unshakable. You're good at this, I admitted, shaking my head. But next time I'll win. You're on, he said with a chuckle. Then his expression softened, and he looked at me with the same warmth I'd come to appreciate. I'm glad we did this. It's nice to feel normal, you know? I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. It is. The power stayed off for the rest of the evening, and we passed the time telling stories and reminiscing about the past. Ethan leaned back against the couch, his eyes locked with mine, as I recounted a memory of him as a mischievous little boy. You were such a handful, I teased, nudging his arm. And you were the most patient mother ever, he said, his voice tinged with affection. I don't know how you did it, I shrugged and smiled softly. It's easy to be patient with someone you love. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I'd intended, but neither of us broke the moment. Ethan reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from my face. His touch lingered just a little too long. You're amazing, Mum, he said softly. I hope you know that. I felt my cheeks flush, a mixture of pride and something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Thank you, Ethan. It means more than you know. As the night wore on, the storm began to die down and the house grew quiet. Ethan helped me light some candles, their soft glow casting a warm golden light over the room. We stayed there on the sofa, talking and laughing into the early hours of the morning. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. Ethan's unwavering presence, his kindness and care reminded me that even in the darkest moments there is light. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, I realized how close we'd become. Not just as mother and son, but as two people facing life's challenges together, bound by an unshakable bond. The storm outside had begun to die down, the rain slowing to a steady patter against the windows. The soft glow of the candles we had lit earlier flickered around the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan and I stayed on the sofa, basking in the quiet after our game of hide and seek. "We should put on a film," he suggested, stretching his arm towards the remote. "Something light. No horror. I've had enough adrenaline for one night." I laughed softly and nodded. "Agreed. Something romantic, maybe." He raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "You're suggesting romance?" I nudged his arm playfully. "Don't act so shocked. I like love stories as much as the next person." After scrolling through the options, he chose a classic love story, one I hadn't seen in years but had always admired. As the film began, the room settled into a comfortable silence, the sound of rain mingling with the dialogue on the screen. At first, we sat at a respectable distance, but as the plot unfolded and the protagonists navigated their way through heartbreak and reconciliation, Ethan moved closer. I didn't think much of it at first. He always liked to be close, even as a child, and the warmth of his presence was comforting. Then, as the film reached one of its softer, more emotional moments, I felt him lean against me, his arm wrapping gently around my shoulders. "Is that okay?" he asked softly, his voice close to my ear. I hesitated for a moment, unsure why the question made my heart skip a beat. "Of course," I said, smiling at him. "It's nice." And it was. His hug was firm yet tender, the kind of gesture that spoke volumes without words. It reminded me of all the times he'd held me as a little boy, seeking comfort after a skinned knee or a bad dream. But there was something different now, something in the way his hold lingered, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm. As the film continued, Ethan turned to look at me. "You remind me of the main character," he said suddenly, his eyes warm and thoughtful. I blinked, surprised. "Me? How so?" "She's strong," he said simply. "Even when things don't go her way, she keeps going. She doesn't give up on the people she loves." His words fell like a blanket over me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "That's sweet, Ethan, but I'm not sure I'm as strong as you think I am." "You are," he insisted, his voice soft but firm. "You've been through so much and you're still here. You're incredible." Before I could respond, he leaned forward and planted a soft kiss on my cheek. The gesture was innocent, affectionate, but it sent a ripple of warmth through me that I couldn't quite explain. I turned to him, startled, but his expression was calm, his eyes filled with nothing but sincerity. "Ethan," I began, not sure what to say. "You don't have to say anything," he said, gently cutting me off. I wanted you to know how much I care about you. You've always been there for me, and I want to be there for you." I nodded, unable to find the right words. Instead, I leaned into his embrace, resting my head on his shoulder. The film continued to play, but neither of us was really watching. The weight of his arm around me, the warmth of his body pressed against mine. It all felt so natural, so grounding, that I didn't want the moment to end. As the credits rolled, Ethan shifted slightly and turned to face me. "Thanks for tonight," he said, his voice soft. "I can't remember the last time I felt this happy." "Neither can I admitted, meeting his gaze. "You've done so much for me, Ethan, more than I could ever repay." "You don't have to repay me," he said with a small smile. "I just want you to be happy." We sat in silence for a while, the film forgotten, as the rain outside slowed to a gentle drizzle. The air between us felt charged, not with awkwardness, but with an unspoken understanding. Ethan's hand rested on mine, his thumb tracing small, soothing circles on my skin. "You're my everything, Mum," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Tears welled up in my eyes at his words, and I reached out to cup his cheek, my thumb brushing away a stray strand of hair. "I'm so lucky to have you, Ethan," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You're my everything too." The weight of the moment pressed down on us, heavy with emotions that neither of us could fully articulate. But in Ethan's steady gaze and the warmth of his touch, I found a peace I hadn't felt in months. It was a connection deeper than words, a bond that transcended the traditional roles of mother and son. As the candles burned low and the rain outside faded to silence, we stayed there on the couch, wrapped in each other's presence. It was a moment of closeness I knew I would treasure forever, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love has the power to heal and bring us back to life. The house was unbearably quiet. After years of hearing the comforting hum of his voice, his laughter echoing down the hall, and the familiar rhythm of his footsteps, the silence felt oppressive. A month ago, my husband had died suddenly, leaving me in a haze of grief. Every corner of our house whispered with memories of him, his favorite mug on the counter, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the bedroom. Then my son Daniel insisted on staying with me, just for a while. "Mum," he said gently, brushing my hair out of my face as I sat numb on the couch, "you shouldn't be alone." At first I resisted. He had his own life to live, a busy career in the city, friends and responsibilities. But Daniel wouldn't take no for an answer, and when he arrived with his overnight bag and that earnest smile, a part of me, deeply grateful, allowed myself to exhale. Daniel brought a warmth that slowly began to fill the void in the house. Mornings began with his voice as he brewed coffee, filling the air with gentle banter. Evenings became a routine of shared meals, old films, and moments of unexpected laughter. He had a way of lightening the weight on my chest, of reminding me that there was still life to be lived. One evening, after dinner, he found me standing by the window, lost in thought. The street lamps outside cast long shadows across the room, their soft glow competing with the dim light of the lamp beside me. "Mum," he said quietly, putting a hand on my shoulder, "you've been staring out there for a while. What's on your mind?" I turned to face him, my eyes filled with tears I couldn't quite hold back. "It's just, everything feels so different now, like I'm stuck in a house that doesn't belong to me anymore." Daniel didn't react immediately. Instead, he pulled me into a hug, his arms strong and firm. "It's still your home, Mum, and I'm here now. We'll get through this together." His words were more comforting than I had expected, and I leaned into him, allowing myself to be comforted by his presence. The days became easier to bear with Daniel around. He had an effortless way of keeping me occupied, whether it was dragging me for walks in the park or convincing me to watch the action films he loved, the ones I would have dismissed as too loud and ridiculous. It wasn't much, but it was enough to distract me from the gaping hole in my chest. One morning, as I sat at the dining table poring over a photo album, Daniel approached with a bright, almost conspiratorial smile. He slid into the seat opposite me, his fingers idly drumming against the wood. "Mum," he began, his tone playful, "when was the last time you bought yourself something nice?" I looked up from the photo of my wedding day, my brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Clothes," he said simply, his grin widening. "I don't think I've seen you in anything new since high school." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, I'm not exactly dressed for a catwalk, Daniel. What's the point?" "The point," he said, leaning forward with mock seriousness, "is that you deserve to feel good, and I think it's time we did something fun for a change." I opened my mouth to argue, but he held up a hand to stop me. "No excuses. We're going shopping and I'm taking you to dinner tonight. It's non-negotiable." His enthusiasm was infectious, and though I hesitated at first, I finally relented. "Fine," I said, shaking my head with a small smile, "but don't think you're talking me into anything extravagant." He winked. "We'll see about that." Late in the afternoon, we were wandering through the busy aisles of a department store. Daniel had taken charge, picking blouses, dresses, and even a few pairs of heels off the racks with the confidence of a seasoned shopper. I followed, bemused by his energy. "This," he said, holding up a simple navy dress, is absolutely you. Try it on. I raised an eyebrow. You think so? Trust me, he replied, shoving it into my hands and steering me towards the fitting rooms. Inside, I slipped into the dress, its soft fabric hugging me in all the right places. I hadn't worn anything so elegant in years, and for a moment I hardly recognized myself in the mirror. When I stepped out to show it to Daniel, his face lit up. Wow, he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. You look amazing, Mum. I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. It's just a dress. It's not just a dress. You look amazing. I'm not taking no for an answer. This is coming home with us. Despite my protests, Daniel insisted on buying the dress, along with a few other items he said were essential. By the time we left the shop, I had more bags than I thought I'd ever own, and Daniel was wearing a triumphant grin. That evening, we went to a small Italian restaurant in the heart of the city. It was cozy, with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. Daniel had even swapped his usual jeans and t-shirt for a button-down and trousers, which made me smile. You clean up nice, I teased as we sat down at our table. Look who's talking, he shot back, gesturing at my new dress. I think half the people in this place are staring at you. Stop it, I said, laughing, but I couldn't deny the warmth his words brought. It had been so long since I felt confident, let alone beautiful. We ordered pasta and wine, the conversation flowing as easily as it had in his childhood. We talked about everything, his work, my memories of his father, even silly anecdotes from his school days. For the first time in weeks, I felt light, almost carefree. At one point, Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine thoughtfully. You know, he said, his voice quieter now, Dad would be very proud of you. I blinked, taken aback by the sudden change in tone. Why do you say that? Because you're strong, he replied, meeting my gaze. Even after everything, you're still here, still trying, and I know it hasn't been easy. A lump formed in my throat, and I reached across the table to shake his hand. I don't feel strong most days, I admitted, but having you here, it helps. His hand tightened around mine, a silent reassurance that he understood. As we left the restaurant that night, the city streets glistened in the soft light of the street lamps. I felt an odd sense of peace. Daniel slipped his arm through mine as we walked back to the car, his presence a steady anchor. Today was nice, I said, looking up at him. Thank you. It's just the beginning, he replied with a wink. I've got plenty more planned for you, Mum. I laughed, the sound surprising even myself with its ease. For the first time in a long time, I felt that life might have some light in it. And as we drove home, the new dress carefully folded in the back seat, I couldn't help but feel grateful. For my son, for his insistence on pulling me out of my grief, and for the small precious moments that reminded me how to live again. When we got home, the warmth of the house enveloped us, a stark contrast to the crisp night air. I slipped off my heels with a sigh of relief and carried the shopping bags into the living room. Daniel followed, a mischievous grin playing on his lips. All right, Mum, he said, putting down his keys. Tonight isn't over yet. I raised an eyebrow, amused at his energy. And what exactly do you have in mind? He leaned casually against the kitchen counter, his expression pensive. How about this? I'll make some mulled wine while you take a hot bath. You deserve to relax after such a hard day. The suggestion took me by surprise. It wasn't often that someone so deliberately took care of me. For years, I'd been the one who looked after others, my husband, Daniel, even neighbours in need. But now, as Daniel took on the role of caretaker, I felt both touched and a little hesitant. You don't have to do all this, darling, I said quietly, though the idea was undeniably tempting. He waved away my protest. I want to. Go on upstairs. I'll bring the wine up when it's ready. I carried myself upstairs, my legs still a little sore from all the walking we'd done earlier. In the bathroom, I turned on the taps and watched as steam began to rise from the filling tub, carrying with it the soothing promise of warmth. I poured in some lavender-scented bath oil, something I hadn't used in years, and undressed, letting the tension of the day fall away with my clothes. As I sank into the bath, the hot water enveloping me like a cocoon, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The lavender mingled with the rising steam, enveloping me in its soothing embrace. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I let my mind drift without being weighed down by grief. A gentle knock on the door jolted me from my thoughts. "Mum, it's me," Daniel called softly from the other side. "Can I come in?" I pulled a towel over me and called back, "Come in." The door creaked open and Daniel came in holding 2 steaming mugs. The smell of mulled wine, cinnamon, cloves and oranges filled the room, and I couldn't help but smile. He placed one mug on the edge of the tub within reach and held the other in his hands. "You shouldn't have bothered," I said, taking the warm mug in my hands. The heat seeped into my palms, soothing me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "Making mulled wine isn't exactly rocket science," he replied with a smile. "I wanted to do something nice for you." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound being the faint crackle of the candle I'd lit on the counter. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, sipping his wine, and for a moment I saw not just my son, but the man he had become. Thoughtful, kind, and far more mature than I sometimes gave him credit for. "You're really something, you know that," I said, my voice soft. He smiled at me over the rim of his cup. "Just taking care of my favorite lady." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help laughing. "You're impossible." His grin widened. "And you love me for it." After finishing my bath and slipping into a plush robe, I joined Daniel downstairs. He had tidied up the kitchen and lit a couple of candles on the coffee table, their flickering light giving the room a cozy glow. A soft instrumental playlist played in the background, and I marveled at how much effort he'd put into making the evening special. "This feels like one of those self-care retreats I see in magazines," I teased as I sank into the couch. "Well, we'll save the mud masks and cucumber slices for next time," he joked, settling into the armchair opposite me. We sat there for hours, sipping mulled wine and talking about everything. Daniel told stories from work, anecdotes from his college days, and even a few embarrassing stories from his childhood that made me laugh so hard I had tears in my eyes. "Remember when Dad tried to teach me how to fish?" Daniel asked, his voice warm with nostalgia. I nodded, a smile tugging at my lips. "How could I forget? You cast your line straight into a tree, and your father spent the next half hour untangling it while you sulked." He groaned, but his grin betrayed him. "In my defense, I was 7. Coordination wasn't exactly my strong point." "It still isn't," I teased, dodging the pillow he threw at me. As the night wore on, the wine loosened our tongues and softened the edges of the day. I realized how much I'd missed it. The connection, the ease of being with someone who knew me so well. Daniel had always been my pride and joy, but in the last month he had become something more, a rock, steady and unyielding in the face of my grief. As the clock struck midnight, I stretched and stifled a yawn. I should go to bed. Daniel stood and helped me to my feet, his hand warm and steady on mine. "Good night, Mum," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. "And remember, today was just the beginning." As I climbed the stairs and crawled into bed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude that ran deeper than words. For the first time since my husband's death, I didn't just feel the pain of his absence, but the comfort of knowing I wasn't alone. Daniel's care, his thoughtfulness. It was a reminder that love can take many forms and that healing, though slow, is possible. After a long and indulgent evening, I lay in bed with the warmth of mulled wine still in my chest. The house was quiet, except for the faint creaking of the old beams in the night. I was just about to fall asleep when a gentle knock on my door woke me. "Mum, it's me," Daniel's voice called softly. I blinked, adjusting to the dim light in my room. "Come in," I replied, sitting up against the headboard and pulling the covers over me. The door opened and Daniel entered, his expression warm and relaxed. He held a small bottle of lavender-scented oil, which caught the faint glow of my bedside lamp. "I noticed you've been rubbing your shoulders all day," he said, gesturing to the oil. "I thought a massage might help." For a moment I hesitated. It wasn't something we'd ever done before. It felt like a gesture associated with a different kind of intimacy. But then I remembered how much he'd cared for me over the past month, how natural it had felt to lean on him during that time. I smiled, putting aside my reservations. "That's very thoughtful of you, Daniel," I said. "Thank you." He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and set it beside the bed. "Turn around and sit here," he instructed gently, his voice calm and reassuring. I moved to the chair, my back to him, and pulled my robe down a little, exposing my neck and shoulders. The warmth of his hands was immediate as he placed them lightly on my shoulders. "Let me know if this is too much pressure," he said, his voice low as he poured a small amount of oil into his palms and rubbed them together. The first touch was gentle, his hands moving with a deliberate softness that quickly eased the tension in my upper back. I sighed deeply and leaned into the sensation. It had been years since I'd allowed myself to enjoy something so simple and soothing. "Remember when Dad used to do this for me after a long day?" I murmured, closing my eyes. "He wasn't very good at it, but he tried." Daniel chuckled softly. "Did I? I remember coming in once and thinking he was torturing you because you were moaning so loudly." I laughed, the sound easy and genuine. It was his way of showing he cared, I suppose. He always said he wanted to look after me, even if he didn't always know how. "Well," Daniel said, his thumbs working a particularly stubborn knot between my shoulder blades, "he taught me well. Looking after you is the least I can do." There was something in his tone, sincere and heartfelt, that made my chest tighten. I turned my head slightly to look at him, his face focused and calm in the soft light. "You've been such a blessing, Daniel," I said softly. "I don't know how I would have gotten through these past few weeks without you." His hands stopped for a moment, resting gently on my shoulders. "I'd do anything for you, Mum. You know that, right?" I nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the depth of his concern. "I do." As he continued the massage, I felt my body sink further into relaxation. His hands moved skillfully, kneading away the tension that had built up over weeks of grief and stress. It was more than just a physical release. It felt like he was releasing some of the emotional weight I was carrying as well. "This oil smells amazing," I said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. "Lavender," he replied. "I read somewhere it's good for stress. I thought it might help you sleep better." I smiled to myself, struck again by his thoughtfulness. "You've always been so thoughtful," I said. "Even as a little boy, you always checked to make sure I was all right." He laughed softly. "I guess some habits stick." When he finally finished, my shoulders felt loose and light, and a pleasant warmth radiated down my back. I turned to face him, my expression one of genuine gratitude. "That was wonderful, Daniel," I said. "Thank you." He smiled, a hint of pride lighting up his face. "Glad you liked it." Standing, he put the oil back on the bedside table and stretched his arms over his head. "You should get some sleep," he said, his tone soft. "It's been a long day." I nodded, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion settle over me. "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Mum," he replied, leaning down to plant a soft kiss on my forehead. Then he turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. As I lay back in bed, the house returning to its soothing silence, I found myself reflecting on the evening. Daniel's presence had been balm for my soul, his kindness and concern helping me to slowly regain my footing. It was a strange but welcome realization that even in the darkest moments, love had a way of shining through, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Sleep came easily that night, bringing with it a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I awoke to the soft light of morning filtering through the curtains painting the walls of my bedroom a warm golden hue. The air was still, the kind of peaceful stillness that follows a good night's sleep. I felt rested for the first time in weeks. The ache in my shoulders from the previous day's shopping and emotions now a distant memory. A soft knock on the door brought me out of my haze. "Mum!" Daniel's voice, warm and familiar, came from the hallway. "Are you awake?" "Come in," I called, pulling the covers up around me. As the door creaked open, Daniel stepped in, a mug of coffee in each hand and a sleepy smile on his face. He was wearing sweats and a plain t-shirt, his hair slightly disheveled from sleep. The sight of him, so comfortable and homely, tugged at my heartstrings. "I thought you could use this," he said, handing me one of the cups. The rich aroma of coffee wafted up and immediately made me feel more awake. "You're spoiling me," I teased, taking the mug and cupping it in my hands. The warmth seeped into my fingers, grounding me. "Me? Someone has to," he shot back, sitting down on the edge of the bed with his own coffee. "Besides, you deserve it." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our drinks. The morning felt unhurried, as if the world outside the house didn't exist. "You know," I began, breaking the silence, "I could get used to this. Coffee in bed, a whole day of pampering. It's not bad." Daniel laughed softly, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Well, don't get too used to it. I'm not sure I can keep up this level of service forever." "Pity," I replied with a mock sigh, though the warmth in my chest was real. "You've been so good to me, Daniel. I don't know how I'll manage when you go back to your life." His expression softened, and he reached out to place a hand over mine where it rested on the blanket. "I'm not going anywhere, Mum. Not until you're ready. We're a team, remember?" His words, so genuine and full of love, made my throat tighten. I squeezed his hand lightly, gratitude, and something deeper stirring in my chest. "I don't say it enough, but thank you," I said, "for everything." He gave me a small smile and leaned in to plant a soft kiss on my cheek. "You don't have to thank me," he murmured. "It's just us now. We take care of each other." The gesture was simple, but it left me momentarily breathless. There was an intimacy in it that hadn't been there before, a quiet reassurance that deepened the connection between us. I turned my head slightly to meet his gaze. There was a warmth in his eyes that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't since his father died. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the air between us heavy with unspoken emotions. "Daniel," I began, but the words caught in my throat. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to say. He seemed to understand, his smile widening as he pulled away slightly. "Finish your coffee," he said, his tone lighter now. "You've got a big day ahead of you." I laughed, grateful for the break in the tension. "Big day? Ha! What have you got planned for me this time?" "You'll see," he teased, getting up and stretching. "I'll let you get ready. Breakfast in 20 minutes. "Make it 30, I replied with a grin, and watched him leave the room. The rest of the morning unfolded with the same sense of easy warmth. Daniel had made pancakes, which we ate around the kitchen table, chatting about everything and nothing. He kept the mood light, telling stories from his childhood that made me laugh so hard I almost choked on my coffee. But beneath the laughter and familiarity, there was a change, subtle but undeniable. The way his hand lingered on mine as he passed the syrup, the warmth in his gaze as he caught me smiling, the soft brush of his shoulder against mine as we cleared the table. Every moment felt charged, even if neither of us acknowledged it. As I washed the last of the dishes, I caught him watching me from across the room, his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his face. "What?" I asked, tilting my head in curiosity. "Nothing," he replied quickly, though the slight blush on his cheeks betrayed him. "Just, you look happy." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "That's because I am." And I realized in that moment that I really was. For the first time in weeks, the heaviness of grief had lifted, replaced by a quiet contentment I hadn't thought possible, and it was all thanks to him. "Come on," he said suddenly, holding out his hand. "Let's go for a walk. It's too beautiful a day to stay indoors." I dried my hands and took his, letting him lead me out into the sunshine. The warmth of his touch lingered long after, a silent promise that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together.
The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the swimming pool, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. I was lying on a float, my eyes closed, the gentle lapping of the water soothing me as I basked in the sun. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Hey, kiddo," my stepfather called out, a teasing note in his voice. I opened my eyes to see him standing at the edge of the pool, his toned body glistening in the sunlight, a playful grin on his face. He was wearing tight swimming trunks that accentuated his physique, and I felt a flutter of excitement. "Hey, Dad, are you coming in?" I replied, tilting my head back and trying to keep my voice light, even though my heart was pounding. "Maybe I will," he said, a mischievous twinkle in his eyes, "but you'll have to catch me first." With that, he dove into the pool, the splash sending ripples across the surface. I couldn't help laughing, my excitement bubbling over as I kicked off my float and swam towards him. The cool water felt invigorating on my skin, the sun warming my back as I ran after him. He was surprisingly fast, gliding effortlessly through the water. "Think you can catch me?" he teased, looking back with a playful grin. "Just wait!" I shouted, determination fueling my strokes as I finally closed the gap between us. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm and pulling him closer. "Got you," he laughed, the sound rich and warm as he turned to face me. "All right, you win this time," he said, his voice softening as our faces hovered inches apart. The tension in the air shifted, electric and undeniable. I could feel his warmth radiating towards me, the intensity of his gaze locked onto mine. "You're getting better," he murmured, a hint of admiration in his tone. "Thanks, Dad. I've been practicing," I replied, my heart racing, and not just from swimming. He stepped closer, the water lapping around our legs, and the intimacy of the moment sent a chill through me. "You know," he said, his voice deep and soft, "I've always wanted to teach you to swim better." "Maybe we could train together more often," I suggested, my breath catching slightly as I felt the chemistry between us intensify. "Yes, I'd like that," he replied, his eyes flicking down to my lips for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "You've grown up so much." There was something deeper in his eyes now, a longing that stirred something in me. I took half a step closer, my pulse quickening. "I feel like I've missed out on time with you," I admitted. His expression softened, and he brushed a damp strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my skin. "I feel the same way." Before I could think, I leaned in slightly, and our lips brushed softly together, an innocent kiss that felt electrifying. It was tentative at first, but the moment was thick with tension, and when our mouths met again, the kiss deepened. I felt his hands find my waist and pull me closer, the warmth of his body lighting a fire inside me. When we finally drew back, both of us breathless, I searched his eyes for any sign of hesitation. But all I saw was desire reflected in his gaze. "What just happened?" I breathed, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty coursing through me. "I don't know," he admitted, stepping back slightly but keeping his hands on my waist, his thumbs brushing gently over my skin. "But I can't pretend it didn't feel amazing." I nodded, my heart racing. It did. There was an undeniable chemistry swirling around us, and I felt encouraged. Maybe we shouldn't fight it. He looked torn for a moment, but then he leaned closer, his breath warm against my cheek. "You really want this?" "More than anything," I whispered, feeling a surge of courage. "Let's not overthink it," he smiled, the warmth returning to his eyes. "All right, then." He closed the distance between us and captured my lips in a passionate kiss that ignited every nerve in my body. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, the water swirling around us as we melted together. I wrapped my arms around his neck, deepening the kiss as I lost myself in the moment. Every touch sent sparks flying, Every caress ignited a desire I hadn't known was there. I felt alive, the thrill of the forbidden coursing through me as our kisses grew more urgent. When we broke the kiss, I looked up at him, breathless. What if someone sees us? Let them, he murmured, his lips brushing against mine, igniting a new wave of longing. I want you, and I'm tired of hiding it. His words sent a thrill through me, and I leaned in, capturing his lips again with more intensity. The world around us faded away, leaving only the two of us tangled in our own desires. His hand explored my body, pulling me closer as the water enveloped us. The heat of our connection contrasted with the coolness of the pool. "Do you really mean that?" I asked between kisses, my heart pounding. "Absolutely," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "I've wanted this for so long." Our kisses grew more heated, and I could feel a sense of urgency rising between us. I could feel the weight of our decisions, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. I pulled him closer, my body fitting perfectly against his as we moved in sync, lost in the whirlwind of emotions. As the sun sank lower, casting a warm glow around us, I whispered, "Let's not stop." He nodded, a fire in his eyes as he leaned in for another kiss. We both surrendered to the moment, the world outside fading away. I could feel the connection between us deepening, the passion igniting something new and exciting that I knew we could no longer ignore. This was just the beginning, and I was ready to explore whatever lay ahead with him by my side. As our lips met again, the world around us faded into a hazy background, consumed by the intensity of our connection. Each kiss was more urgent than the last, a desperate longing pouring from us as we explored this uncharted territory together. I could feel his heart racing beneath my fingertips as I ran my hands over his strong shoulders and down his arms. The sensation sent a wave of heat through me, igniting a fire that pulsed with every touch. The cool water enveloped us, a stark contrast to the warmth building between our bodies. "Let's go to the shallow end," I suggested breathlessly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want to feel closer to you." He nodded, his eyes dark with desire, and together we made our way to the edge of the pool, where the water was warmer and the air thick with anticipation. I climbed onto the edge of the pool, feeling the smooth tiles against my skin, and he followed, his body moving closer to mine. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice low as he slid next to me, our shoulders touching. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but the longing was undeniable. "It's more than okay," I replied, my heart racing. "I want this." With a hesitant smile, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face before leaning in again. This kiss was different, softer, yet charged with a simmering intensity. I melted into him, our lips moving in perfect harmony, a sweet rhythm that echoed the beating of our hearts. As the kiss deepened, I felt his hands on my waist, pulling me closer, the warmth radiating from him like a flame. I relished the sensation, my body responding instinctively to his touch. I felt brave, daring to lean into the moment as I wrapped my arms around his neck, feeling the strength in his arms as he held me close. "You feel so good," he murmured against my lips, his breath warm and inviting. I could feel the longing in his voice, a reflection of my own desires. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The words slipped out before I could hold them back, but there was no shame in this moment, only raw honesty. "Then let's not hold back," he said, his lips teasingly brushing against mine before capturing them again. The kiss ignited a spark that spread through me, overwhelming and intoxicating. I could feel his hands exploring my back, tracing the curves of my body, and I responded by pressing against him, my heart racing wildly. "Dad," I breathed, pulling back for a moment to catch my breath, the gravity of what we were doing hitting me. "Is this really okay?" "Shh," he whispered, his fingers gently stroking my cheek. "Just let it happen." With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, I surrendered to the moment and let my instincts guide me. I leaned in again, and our lips met with renewed passion. Each kiss felt like a promise, a declaration of our unspoken feelings. His hands moved lower, gripping my waist tightly as I tangled my fingers in his hair, losing myself in the sensation. The world outside faded away, leaving only us and the desire that crackled between us like electricity. "Ethan," he murmured between kisses, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected to feel this way about you." "Neither did I confessed, my heart racing as I leaned into him. "But it feels so right." The air grew thick with longing as I pressed my body against his, feeling the heat radiating between us. I could feel the urgency in his movements, and it sent shivers down my spine. Our kisses grew more heated, more desperate, a reflection of the passion that was building within us. As I pulled back slightly, my lips hovering just above his, I looked into his eyes. "What do we do now?" I whispered, my heart racing. "We take it one step at a time," he replied, his voice low and steady. "Together." With that, we leaned into each other again, our lips colliding as if the world outside had melted away. I felt as if we were enveloped in our own bubble, a place where nothing else mattered. Each kiss sent waves of warmth through me, igniting a desire I hadn't known was possible. Time seemed irrelevant as we lost ourselves in each other. I pulled him closer, feeling the warmth of his body against mine, a perfect fit as we surrendered to the moment. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and each kiss added fuel to the fire that raged inside of us. "Let's promise to keep this between us for now," he murmured against my lips, the weight of his words grounding me. "I promise," I whispered, my heart pounding with excitement and a touch of fear. I could feel the gravity of what we were doing, but the thrill of being so close to him, of exploring this new bond, was too tempting to resist. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the pool, we held each other, savoring the intimacy we had created. I felt safe in his arms, a sense of belonging enveloping me. "Whatever happens next, I'm here for you," he said softly, brushing his lips against my forehead. The tenderness of the gesture ignited a warmth within me. "I know," I replied, my heart swelling with affection. "And I'm here for you, too." It was then that I realized we were embarking on a journey together, one filled with uncertainty, but also with endless possibilities. With him by my side, I felt a sense of hope and excitement for what lay ahead, a thrilling adventure waiting just below the surface.
My name is Jessica, and I have a story to tell. A story that may shock some of you, and perhaps even cause others to question my choices. But this is my truth. It's one I've kept hidden for so long, and I've finally decided it's time to come clean. I have to start by saying that, no, this isn't some wild tale of outrageous behavior or explicit scandal. This is about love, loneliness, and how a simple connection went horribly wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning. My husband Richard and I have been married for almost 10 years. We met when we were both fresh out of university. He was ambitious, charming, and the kind of man who could walk into any room and have everyone's attention in an instant. I fell in love with him, and the early days of our relationship were like something out of a romantic film. It was perfect. Fast forward a few years and life wasn't so picture perfect. Richard's work took him away from home more often than not. His job was demanding, and he was constantly traveling for business meetings, conferences, and networking events. While I understood that his work was important, his absence took a toll on our marriage. We became distant, barely speaking for days at a time, and when we did speak, it was usually superficial conversation. You know, the usual "how was your day?" and "what's for dinner?" stuff. But underneath it all, I was lonely. I craved attention, companionship, and someone to fill the void Richard had unwittingly left in my life. That's when things started to change. We lived on a quiet, peaceful farm just outside the city. One of the things that had drawn us to this place was the space and opportunity to keep animals. We had a few chickens, some goats, and of course our horse, Midnight. Midnight was a beautiful, strong, black stallion with a temperament so gentle that you felt he understood emotions better than most people. I had always loved horses, but Midnight was special. He had been a gift from Richard for our 5th wedding anniversary, a gesture to show how much he cared, even though he couldn't always be there. During the long, lonely days when Richard was away, Midnight became my source of comfort. I would spend hours in the stable, brushing him, talking to him, just being in his presence. It sounds strange, I know, but animals have a way of sensing when you're hurting. Midnight always seemed to know when I was sad or frustrated, and he would nudge me gently with his nose as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." In time, these moments with Midnight became the highlight of my days. I found myself pouring my heart out to him, telling him things I couldn't even say to my husband. Midnight was patient, never judgmental, and always there. It was as if he had become the emotional support I was missing. I know what you're thinking. How can I compare a horse to my husband? But you must understand that Richard was absent and Midnight was all I had. The turning point came one summer evening. Richard was out of town as usual, and I was feeling particularly low. I had just finished talking to him, and once again it felt like we were two strangers living separate lives. I went out to the stables, hoping to find some peace with Midnight. As I brushed his coat, I began to talk to him as I always did. But something was different this time. I was venting about my frustrations, my loneliness, and how disconnected I felt from Richard. I rambled on, not even thinking about what I was saying, when I suddenly realized that I was talking about Midnight in a way that made my heart race. I caught myself, shook my head, and laughed it off. "Jessica, you're being ridiculous," I said to myself. Midnight was a horse, a magnificent one, yes, but still a horse. I tried to brush off the strange thoughts that had begun to creep into my mind, but as the days went on, I found myself returning to the stable more often, staying longer than I should have, and feeling a growing sense of attachment to Midnight that I couldn't explain. I felt guilty. How could I be so emotionally invested in an animal when I had a husband? But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the bond became. Midnight was always there, and Richard wasn't. The truth is, I didn't cheat in the way you might expect. There was no physical betrayal, no affair in the traditional sense. But emotionally, I had crossed a line. I had begun to confide in Midnight in ways that should have been reserved for my husband. Then, one evening, it all came crashing down. Richard came home unexpectedly from one of his trips. I didn't hear him pull into the driveway, and I was in the stable as usual, with Midnight. I didn't realize how much time I had spent there, how much I had become absorbed in this strange emotional attachment. When Richard came into the stables, he found me standing next to Midnight, whispering to him. I didn't notice Richard until it was too late. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice was sharp, full of confusion and suspicion. His eyes darted between me and Midnight, as if trying to piece together the scene before him. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this without sounding crazy? Richard stood there, staring at me, waiting for an explanation that I didn't know how to give. How could I even begin to explain the emotional whirlwind I had been caught up in? The silence in the stable seemed to go on forever, broken only by the soft snort of Midnight, who was completely unaware of the storm that had just blown in. "Jessica, what the hell is going on?" Richard asked again, his voice a mixture of confusion and anger. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. I instinctively stepped back and put a hand on Midnight's side, as if he could somehow shield me from the confrontation that was about to happen. "It's not what you think, Richard," I stammered, though I wasn't even sure what he was thinking. How could he explain what he was seeing when I barely understood it myself? He shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Then tell me, because I come home early and find you here, whispering to our horse as if he's... I don't even know what. What am I supposed to think?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain the emotional connection I had developed with Midnight without sounding completely insane. "Richard, you've been gone a lot lately," I began, seeing the frustration in his eyes. "I know it's your job, and I know you work hard for us, but I've been lonely, and Midnight. He's been there for me. He listened to me when I didn't have anyone else." He threw up his hands in despair. "He's a horse, Jessica." "You talk like he's a person." I winced at his words, but I couldn't deny that he was right. "I know," I whispered, "but he was there when you weren't. I started talking to him because I didn't have anyone else. It got out of hand." Richard looked at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "So what? You're saying you had an emotional affair with a horse?" The words sounded absurd even to me, but the reality of the situation wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said quietly, tears welling up in my eyes. "I was just so lonely, Richard. I needed someone to talk to, and Midnight was there." He shook his head again, clearly struggling to take it all in. "So what are you telling me? That you love him? That you'd rather be with him than with me?" His voice cracked slightly, and I could tell there was a deep sense of betrayal beneath the anger. "No, of course not," I replied quickly, stepping forward and reaching for his hand. "I love you, Richard, but I was lonely and I made a mistake. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I turned to Midnight when I should have turned to you." He pulled his hand away and paced the small stable. "This is madness. I don't even know how to wrap my head around it. I come home and this is what I find? My wife confessing to some kind of emotional affair with our horse?" I stood there helpless, not knowing how to fix the situation. "Richard, please, it wasn't like that. I didn't do anything physical, nothing inappropriate. I was lost in loneliness." He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there, his back to me, trying to collect his thoughts. Then he finally spoke. "Do you know how crazy this sounds, Jessica? How ridiculous this whole situation is?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but it's the truth. I let my loneliness cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to come to this." Richard turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you felt this way?" "I tried," I said, my voice shaking, "but every time I brought it up, you were too busy or too tired or just distracted, and I finally gave up. I thought maybe that was the way things were going to be, so I found comfort in Midnight. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but he was there for me in a way that you weren't." He sighed heavily and ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't know you felt that way. I thought we were fine." "We weren't," I replied quietly, "but I didn't want to burden you with it. You were always so busy with work and I didn't want to seem needy. But the truth is that I needed you, Richard. I needed my husband, and when you weren't there, I turned to Midnight." There was a long silence between us as we both stood there, the weight of the situation sinking in. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice much softer this time. "I don't know what to do, Jessica. I don't know how to go on from here." I took a deep breath, feeling the tears spill over onto my cheeks. "I don't either," I admitted. "But I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I love you, and I don't want to lose you." Richard looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. "I love you too, Jessica, but this is going to take time." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." He sighed again, finally stepping closer to me. "We need to talk about this, really talk about everything, not just Midnight, but us. Where we went wrong and how we can fix it." I nodded, reaching out to take his hand again, this time feeling him squeeze it back. "I'm ready to talk, Richard. I'm ready to make things right." As we stood there in the stable, the air thick with the weight of our conversation, I realized that this was the first step in rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. And with that, Jessica and Richard began the long process of healing their marriage, learning to reconnect and rediscovering the love that had once brought them together. Jen was sitting at the kitchen table staring at her phone. It was 7:30 p.m. and she hadn't heard a word from Dan. He was working late again, as he had been almost every night for the past few months. Her fingers hovered over the screen, thinking about sending him another text, but she stopped herself. What was the point? He'd probably reply with the same message he always did: busy, talk later. But later never seemed to come. With a sigh, she put the phone down and leaned back in her chair. The house was quiet, except for the sound of soft paws on the hardwood floor. The dog, her golden retriever, came trotting over, tail wagging as if trying to cheer her up. Jen smiled and felt a small warmth rise in her chest. At least the dog was always happy to see her. "Hey, boy," she whispered, patting her leg. The dog quickly came to her side and nuzzled his head into her lap. Jen stroked his soft fur, her fingers running through his golden coat. "Looks like it's just us again tonight." She got up and walked into the living room, the dog following close behind, always eager to be close. Jen settled down on the couch and grabbed the remote, flicking through the channels with little interest. Everything on TV seemed boring, or maybe it was just that she didn't have the energy to care. Lately, everything felt like it was on repeat: work, home, and endless nights alone while Dan worked late. The dog jumped up beside her and curled up against her legs. He rested his head on her knee, looking up at her with those big, friendly eyes. Jen smiled softly. "At least I've got you, haven't I?" she said, rubbing his ears. It was a small comfort, but at that moment the dog's company was the only thing that kept her from feeling completely alone. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Jen and Dan had been married for 4 years, and at first everything had felt so easy. They used to spend hours talking, planning their future, taking spontaneous weekend trips. She could still remember how Dan would surprise her with little things, like a bouquet of flowers or her favorite coffee on a Saturday morning. But now it seemed like those moments were long gone. Dan's job had taken over his life, and Jen felt she had faded into the background, almost invisible. As the weeks passed, the distance between them seemed to grow. Dan would come home late, exhausted, barely saying a few words before going to bed. Jen tried to talk to him, tried to get him to open up, about work, about why he was always so distracted, but their conversations never went anywhere. He'd just brush her off, say it was nothing, or that things would settle down soon. But soon never seemed to come. One night, Jen was sitting on the couch, the dog by her side as usual, when her phone buzzed. She answered it, hoping it was Dan with news that he'd be home early. But it was just another text from him saying, "I'll be late, don't wait up." Jen sighed and put the phone down. She looked down at the dog, who had his head in her lap, his tail tapping gently against the sofa. "You know," she said quietly, "you're starting to feel like the only one who's here for me anymore." She felt a lump form in her throat. She stroked his fur, finding comfort in the simple act of being close to him. It's silly, isn't it, talking to a dog like that? The dog didn't move, just lay there, quiet and still, as if to tell her it was all right. Jen began to rely on the dog more and more. When she got home from work, the first thing she did was greet him and hug him as if he were the one constant in her life. Dan would come home late, barely looking up from his phone, while Jen spent her evenings with the dog. They would go for long walks, spend hours in the park, and sometimes Jen would talk to the dog as if he could understand everything she was going through. He couldn't answer, but he was always there, and his faithful presence made her feel a little less lonely. Then, one Saturday afternoon, something happened that changed everything. Jen was lying in bed reading a book, with the dog snuggled up beside her. Dan was supposed to be at the office, working on some big project, or so Jen thought. But suddenly she heard the sound of the front door opening. Her heart skipped a beat. Dan was home early. She hadn't expected him for hours. She sat up quickly, her hand still on the dog's back. Moments later, Dan appeared in the bedroom doorway, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked at Jen, then at the dog curled up on the bed beside her. "What's going on?" Dan asked, his voice sharp. Jen blinked, confused by his tone. "What do you mean?" she replied, shifting slightly. Dan crossed his arms, his jaw clenching. "I come home early and find you in bed with the dog. What's that about?" Jen's stomach twisted. She hadn't thought about how it might look to Dan. "Dan, it's nothing like that," she said quickly. "The dog he was here for me, that's all." "For you?" Dan repeated, raising an eyebrow. "He's a dog, Jen. You're acting like he's more than that." Jen felt her face flush with embarrassment, but also with frustration. Dan didn't get it. He didn't understand how lonely she'd been, how much she'd needed someone, anyone, to be there for her when he wasn't. "You're never there, Dan," Jen said, her voice shaking. "You're always at work, and when you are home, you barely speak to me. I've been alone for months, and the dog, well, he's the only one who's paid attention." Dan stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "So what? Are you saying the dog is going to replace me?" Jen shook her head, feeling tears tugging at the corners of her eyes. "It's not like that. I'm not trying to replace you. I didn't know what else to do. I was lonely and the dog was here." For a moment they stood in silence, the tension in the room thick and heavy. Dan ran a hand through his hair and looked away, as if trying to make sense of it all. "This isn't normal, Jen," he finally said, his voice softer now. "You can't go on like this. I know I haven't been around much, but it's not healthy." Jen bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. "I know," she whispered, "but I didn't know how else to cope. You weren't here, and I didn't want to burden you with my feelings, so I just leaned on the dog." Dan sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked tired, not just from work, but from everything that had built up between them. "Why didn't you tell me you were feeling like this?" Jen wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "Because I didn't think you'd care. You were so focused on work that it felt like I didn't matter anymore." Dan shook his head and looked down at the floor. "I never wanted you to feel that way," he said quietly. "But you're right. I've been distant. I thought I was doing the right thing by working hard, but I didn't realize how much I was neglecting us." Jen sat down beside him, her heart heavy with the weight of all that had gone unsaid. "I just want us to feel close again," she whispered. "I miss the way we used to be." Dan grabbed her hand and held it tightly. "I miss it too," he said quietly. "Maybe we can try to make it right. I know it won't be easy, but I don't want us to keep drifting apart." Jen nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "I don't want that either." In the weeks that followed, Jen and Dan began to rebuild what had been broken. They went to counseling, talked about their feelings, and slowly began to reconnect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jen knew she couldn't continue to use the dog as an emotional crutch. He was a dog, a wonderful companion, but he couldn't replace the human connection she needed with Dan. The dog still curled up beside her sometimes, still followed her around the house with his tail wagging. But now Jen made a conscious effort to lean on Dan more. They took time to be together, to talk, to be present in each other's lives again. Jen was learning that love wasn't just about being together in the good times, it was about staying together when things got hard. And although it took an unexpected bond with a dog to make her realize it, she and Dan were finally finding their way back to each other, one small step at a time.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I need to get something off my chest. Something I've kept buried for far too long. Before you judge me, please listen to my story. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, and I'm still struggling to understand how it all happened so quickly. It's a memory that has haunted me for years, something my husband made me do that changed the course of my life. It all began a few years ago. My husband John and I had been married for almost 10 years. Like most couples, we'd had our ups and downs, but I never expected this. John was a loving man, but over time something changed. He became distant, more controlling and less affectionate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the stress of work, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, John came home from work with a strange energy about him. He seemed unusually cheerful, but there was something almost unsettling about the way he looked at me. We had dinner as usual, and just as I was about to clear the table, he asked me to sit down. His tone was serious, so I complied, my heart starting to race as I sensed that this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes avoiding mine. "There's something I need to tell you." I nodded, waiting for him to continue, but the words that followed were not what I expected. He told me that he wanted to spice up our relationship, that he'd been feeling bored, and that he thought it was time we tried something different. At first, I thought he meant a romantic getaway, or maybe some counseling to rekindle the spark. But no, what he was suggesting was far from that. "I've arranged for us to meet two men," he said bluntly. "They're coming over this weekend." I stared at him, not understanding what he was getting at. I didn't know if he was joking or if this was some kind of sick test, but his expression was deadly serious. My stomach churned and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What do you mean, two men?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're friends of mine," he said, trying to sound casual, as if this was normal. "We're going to spend the night with them." I was speechless. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what he was saying. This wasn't my husband. This wasn't the man I had sworn to spend my life with. He was talking about bringing two strangers into our home, into our marriage, as if it were nothing. The thought alone made me feel sick. But more than that, I felt betrayed. How could he even suggest such a thing? "John, have you lost your mind?" I finally managed to say, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This isn't us. Why would you even—" But he cut me off before I could finish. "Rachel, this is happening," he said, his tone sharp. "You have to understand. This is something I want, something we need." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I loved John, but I couldn't understand why he would push me into something so degrading, something that felt like it would destroy everything we had built together. I told him no, that I wasn't going to go through with it. I thought that would be the end of it, that he'd come to his senses and drop the idea. But I was wrong. Over the next few days, John became increasingly distant. He hardly spoke to me unless it was about the plan. He started coming home late, and when I asked where he had been, he gave vague answers. Our conversations became tense, and the love that once filled our home was replaced by a suffocating silence. I felt trapped, isolated, and confused. How had our marriage, come to this? By Friday, the fear had settled deep in my chest. John insisted that the meeting would go ahead, no matter what I said. I considered leaving, packing my bags and walking out the door, but I didn't. As much as I hated to admit it, part of me was still holding on to the man I thought I knew, hoping that this was just a phase, something we could work through. I wasn't ready to throw away our life together, but at the same time, I couldn't bear the thought of going through with this plan. Saturday night came too quickly. The men, John's so-called friends, arrived promptly at 8 p.m. I sat on the couch, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to hold back the tears. I didn't even know their names, and here they were, sitting in my living room, talking to my husband like old buddies. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to disappear, to run out of the house and never look back. But then John leaned over, his hand on my knee. "Rachel, it's time," he whispered. I froze, my mind screaming at me to get up and go, but my body refused to move. John's hand felt like a weight on my knee, holding me in place. I couldn't look at him, and I certainly couldn't look at the two men sitting opposite me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the room seemed to be closing in around me. "Rachel, please," John said again, his voice lower now, almost pleading. There was something in his tone that made me stop. It wasn't just pleading, it was desperation. For the first time in days, I saw a glimmer of vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't just about satisfying some twisted fantasy for him. It was about control, power, and something deeper that I couldn't quite understand. But that didn't make it right. None of it felt right. "I can't do this, John," I finally whispered, my voice breaking. "This isn't who we are." He sighed heavily and sat back, rubbing his temples in frustration. "You think I want this?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I'm doing this for us, Rachel." And, let's call him Marcus, cleared his throat. He seemed to sense the tension, but there was an air of impatience about him. "Look," he said, his voice calm but firm, "if this isn't going to happen, we should probably go." I looked up at him, and for the first time I really looked at him. He wasn't what I had expected. He was calm, even respectful, and his demeanor seemed more sympathetic than I had imagined. I had this idea in my head that these men were predators, but they weren't. They were just people. And somehow that made the whole situation even more confusing. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to be part of what was becoming. But the weight of it all, the years with John, the love we once shared, the hope that maybe somehow things could get back to normal, kept me sitting there. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, suffocated by my own indecision. Then John spoke, his voice soft but determined. "Rachel, if you leave, we're finished." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. I looked at him in disbelief, trying to comprehend what he had just said. He had drawn a line in the sand, and I had to decide which side I was going to stand on. I felt tears well up in my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let him see me break. "I've given you everything," he continued, his voice calm but cold. "I've provided for you. I've loved you. And this one thing is all I ask for in return." I stood up, my legs shaking but determined. "This isn't love, John," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is manipulation." His eyes flashed with anger, but I didn't care. I couldn't do this. I wouldn't do this. I turned towards the door, fully expecting him to shout, to grab me, to try and stop me. But he didn't. Instead, I heard him mutter something like, "You're going to regret this." Maybe I would. Maybe leaving was a mistake. But in that moment, I knew I had to go. I couldn't let John or anyone else force me into something I didn't feel comfortable with. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. My legs carried me down the street, my mind racing. Where would I go? What was I going to do? I had no answers, only a deep sense of betrayal and loss. I walked for what felt like hours before I found myself outside my best friend Sarah's house. I knocked on the door, praying that she would be home. When she opened the door and saw my tear-streaked face, she didn't ask any questions. She just hugged me tightly and took me inside. I stayed with Sarah for the next few days, trying to process everything that had happened. I felt empty, like a part of me had been ripped away. I missed John, but I also knew I couldn't go back. The damage had been done, and there was no fixing what had been broken. John tried to call me a few times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry. He was all over the place, and I couldn't keep up with his changing emotions. I didn't answer any of his calls, and eventually he stopped trying. Months went by, and I began to rebuild my life, slowly but surely. I filed for divorce, knowing that our marriage was beyond saving. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but in the end it was the right one. I couldn't stay in a relationship where I was being manipulated and forced into situations that went against everything I believed in. I still think about John sometimes, about the life we could have had if things had turned out differently. But I've come to realize that I deserve better. I deserve a love based on trust, respect, and mutual understanding, not control and manipulation.
It was a routine call for a minor repair, nothing special at first. I hadn't thought much about it. I was 60, living alone in a quiet, predictable world, untouched by the excitement of desire for longer than I cared to admit. But that Wednesday afternoon, when Jacob stepped through my door, young, strong, and filled with a nervous charm, I felt something shift inside me. What started as an innocent moment soon spiraled into something far more dangerous. Our meetings, once professional, became filled with tension, and as I crossed boundaries I hadn't even known existed, the line between need and obsession blurred. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected it, but it had awakened something in me I could no longer ignore. I had been staring at the dripping sink for days, watching the water collect in the basin, a constant reminder of how little attention I paid to my surroundings. Now, after years of carefully curated home improvements, everything seemed pointless without someone to share them with. The house had grown too big after my divorce, each room echoing with memories I tried not to think about. The kitchen, once the center of our family life, had fallen into a quiet disrepair, much like me. So, when the sink leak became too much to ignore, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called for help. I found a local handyman, Jacob. The name didn't mean anything to me, just someone to get the job done. I expected a grizzled old man, experienced, maybe a little rough around the edges. But when I opened the door that chilly Wednesday afternoon, I found myself staring at a young man in his 20s. Jacob stood there, towering over me, a toolbox in hand, wearing a simple gray shirt that stretched across his broad chest. He had a nervous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but there was something about him that immediately drew me in. "Hi, I'm here to take a look at the sink," he said, his voice deep but soft. I blinked, startled for a moment by the way my heart skipped just slightly in my chest. It was an absurd reaction, really. At my age, those little sparks were supposed to be things of the past. And yet, there it was, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. "Come in," I managed to say, stepping aside to let him into the house. I watched him as he moved around the room, his eyes scanning the kitchen with quiet concentration. There was an efficiency to the way he worked, kneeling down to inspect the sink, his hands moving expertly over the pipes. I found myself lingering nearby, unable to look away. I stood by the kitchen island, pretending to be busy with something else, but my attention never left him. There was something about the way he moved, the strength in his arms as he tightened the screws under the sink, the quiet concentration etched into his face. I hadn't been this close to a young man in years. I hadn't even thought about what it would be like until now. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something was stirring inside me. It wasn't just his looks, though Jacob was undeniably attractive in that rugged, effortless way. No, it was the energy he brought into the room, a vitality that contrasted sharply with the silence that had settled over my life. There was a warmth about him that I hadn't felt in so long. For a moment, I found myself leaning against the counter, watching him too closely. I adjusted my robe, a robe I had never considered provocative before, and straightened up, trying to shake the ridiculous thoughts that were creeping into my mind. Jacob looked up from his work and caught my eye. I could see the flicker of surprise in his expression as his eyes darted quickly over me, then back to the sink. His cheeks flushed slightly, and I couldn't help but feel a small thrill at the reaction. It was innocent enough, but I felt something stirring that I hadn't allowed myself to feel for so long. Desire. I walked over to where he was kneeling and watched him work. He was focused, but there was an undercurrent of nervousness in the way his hands moved, as if he was trying not to acknowledge my presence too much. "Everything going well down there?" I asked, my voice softer than I had intended. He nodded, not looking up. "Yeah, just a small leak, Should be fixed in a few minutes. I couldn't help myself. I reached out and touched his shoulder lightly, just a gentle squeeze. His body tensed under my hand, and I felt the rush of power that came from knowing I had affected him. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, and I wasn't ready to let it go just yet. "You're really strong," I said, my voice taking on a slightly more flirtatious tone. He looked up at me, startled, his face flushing even more. Thanks." I smiled at him, a soft, knowing smile. I could feel the tension building between us, thickening the air in the small space of my kitchen. It was unspoken, but it was there. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to stay professional, but the way his hands trembled slightly as he tightened the last bolt told me everything I needed to know. I stepped a little closer, leaning over the counter, watching his every move. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, and I could see the way he was avoiding my gaze now, trying to maintain his composure. "You need any help?" I asked, knowing full well he didn't. He shook his head quickly, focusing on packing up his tools, but his hands were shaking. I reached out again, this time letting my fingers brush against his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin under my touch. He froze for a moment, and I could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. There was a part of him that wanted to give in, I could tell, but there was also a part of him that knew better. He was younger, and I was a woman who should have known better too, but in that moment, it didn't matter. I let my hand linger on his arm, feeling the tension between us crackle like electricity. He looked at me, his breath shallow, his eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, I thought he might step forward, close the distance between us, but then he took a step back, breaking the spell. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice shaky, "I'm just here to fix the sink." I smiled softly, amused by how flustered he was. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs fixing?" I asked, my voice teasing now. He looked like he didn't know whether to stay or run. His hands were trembling as he gathered the last of his tools, and I could see the way he was struggling to maintain control. I took a step closer, my lips just inches from his. "There's something else you could take care of for me," I whispered, my voice low and suggestive. He didn't respond, just stared at me, frozen in place. I leaned in as if I were about to kiss him, but before I could, he took a quick step back, his hands up in front of him as if to ward me off. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I really can't." I pouted, feeling a little disappointed, but I knew he wasn't going to give in. Not yet, anyway. He left in a hurry, practically running out of the house, leaving me standing in the kitchen, alone again. But there was something about the way he left. It wasn't just the awkwardness. There was a tension in the air, something unfinished, something unresolved. And I knew deep down that although Jacob had said no, it wasn't because he wasn't interested. It was because he didn't trust himself not to say yes. The days that followed were a strange mix of excitement and frustration. I couldn't stop thinking about Jacob, the way he'd hesitated, the way his eyes had lingered on me just a little too long. It had been years since I'd felt like that, since I'd felt anything, really. And now, suddenly, there was this young man who had awakened something in me that I thought had long since died. I hadn't expected to see him again. I thought he'd probably told himself he wasn't coming back, that he couldn't come back. But then, about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered it, it was him. "Hi, this is Jacob, the plumber. I was just calling to see if everything was okay with the sink. Did the repair hold up?" His voice was polite, even professional, but I could hear the trembling underneath. He was nervous, and that excited me more than I cared to admit. "Oh, Jacob," I said, trying to keep my tone casual, though I knew exactly where this was going. "Funny you should ask. The sink is fine, but there's another problem in the bathroom I was hoping you could take a look at. It's probably nothing major, but I wouldn't feel right if I didn't have a professional look at it." There was a pause at the other end of the line. I could hear him weighing his options, deciding whether to come back. "I can be there in about an hour," he finally said. As I hung up, I couldn't help but smile to myself. This time I had no intention of letting him off so easily. When Jacob arrived, he was visibly more nervous than the first time. He tried to maintain his usual calm, professional demeanor, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided my gaze as I led him upstairs to the bathroom. The problem with the tap was minor, just a loose handle, but I knew it wasn't the tap that was bringing him back. As he worked, I stood nearby, watching him in silence. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that made my skin tingle. He was more focused this time, his head down, his eyes on the work, but I could tell he was more aware of me now, more aware of the space between us. I couldn't resist any longer. "Jacob," I said quietly, moving a little closer. "I've been thinking about you." He paused for a moment, his hand tightening around the tap. He didn't look up, but I could see his knuckles turning white, his breathing quickening slightly. "Have you?" His voice was careful, as if he wasn't sure if he should acknowledge what had happened earlier. "I couldn't stop thinking about last time," I continued, my voice low and intimate. "You seemed interested, but you held back. Why was that?" He didn't answer at first, his hand still working on the tap, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "It's just, I'm a professional," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wouldn't be right." "Wouldn't it?" I asked, moving even closer. Now I could feel the heat radiating from him. "Who says what's right or wrong, Jacob? You're a grown man, and I'm a grown woman. We both know there's something here, something between us. You can feel it, can't you?" He looked at me then, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with the same conflict that had been there the last time. He was struggling, I could see it. He was trying so hard to stay professional, to keep that distance between us, but the tension had already built up to the point of no return, and I wasn't going to let it go now. I let my hand brush his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath my fingertips. His breathing was ragged, and for a moment I thought he might pull away again. But then, without warning, he reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me towards him. It wasn't rough, but it was firm, his face now inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Margaret," he said, his voice deep and intense, "this isn't a game." "I never said it was," I replied, my lips curling into a smile. There was no turning back now. Jacob's hands were still on my arm, firm but hesitant, as if he didn't trust himself to let go. There was something raw and unguarded in his expression now, none of the nervous politeness he had shown before. His eyes locked with mine, and I could feel the tension between us turn into something deeper, something far more dangerous. I leaned closer, letting my lips hover just inches from his. His grip tightened slightly, as if he wanted to pull me closer and push me away at the same time. For a moment, I wondered if he would break, if he would walk out the door and never come back. But then his breathing quickened, and I knew he was feeling the same as I was. "Sometimes you just have to let go," I whispered, my voice barely audible but filled with an unmistakable promise. And Jacob hesitated for another beat, and then, as if something inside him had snapped, he pulled me even closer and kissed me. It wasn't soft or tentative like before. This kiss was filled with the weight of everything we'd both been holding back. His lips moved against mine with a kind of urgency that sent shivers down my spine, his hands gripping my waist as if he was afraid to let go. I kissed him back, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, feeling the heat between us build with each passing second. The world around us seemed to blur, the bathroom, the sink, the leak. It all disappeared as his touch consumed me. His hand slid down to my hips, and I could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself back, afraid to go too far but already too far. We pulled apart just long enough to catch our breath, our foreheads touching, our breathing ragged and uneven. I could feel his heart pounding against his chest, his pulse racing beneath my fingers. The look in his eyes told me all I needed to know. This wasn't just a moment of weakness for him. This was something he'd been fighting for a long time, something he didn't want to admit to himself. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching mine for answers. I smiled, stepping back just enough to give him some space, but not too far. I could feel the attraction between us, the undeniable bond that had brought us to this point. "I think you know the answer to that, Jacob," I said quietly, my voice filled with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. "We've already crossed the line. Why stop now?" For a moment, he said nothing. He just stood there, watching me, the conflict still flickering in his eyes. But then, with one last glance at the door, he reached for me again, his hands finding their way back to my waist, pulling me closer. This time there was no hesitation, no doubt. This time we both knew exactly what we were doing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Jacob and I barely made it out of the bathroom, the tension between us finally unraveling in a way that felt both inevitable and exhilarating. His hands were everywhere, my shoulders, my waist, my hips. His touch, firm yet respectful, as if he was letting go of control but still maintaining some semblance of restraint. But I didn't want any restraint, not now. I hadn't felt this way for years, not since before the divorce. For so long, my life had been filled with routine, dinners alone, quiet evenings in front of the television, the occasional phone call from my grown-up children. I hadn't realized how much I had longed for this, how much I needed to feel wanted and desired again. Jacob kissed me deeply, his lips trailing down my neck, his hands sliding down to cradle my hips. I let out a soft gasp, my head falling back as I surrendered to the moment. There was something intoxicating about being with him, this young, strong man who seemed to see me in a way that no one had for so long. It was more than just physical attraction. It was a connection that went deeper, something neither of us had expected but couldn't deny. Eventually we made our way to the bedroom, the air between us charged with an energy I hadn't felt in years. As we lay together, tangled in the sheets, I couldn't help but smile to myself, feeling more alive than I had in what felt like a lifetime. "I've never done anything like this," Jacob murmured, his voice low and husky as he lay beside me, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my arm. "Neither have I admitted, my voice just as soft. He turned to look at me, his expression filled with something I hadn't expected, vulnerability. "I shouldn't have," he said, shaking his head slightly, "but I don't regret it." I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath my fingertips, and smiled softly. "Neither do I." We lay there in silence for a while after that, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if we had both crossed a line we didn't know existed, but neither of us wanted to go back. Eventually, Jacob sat up and looked at the clock. "I should go," he said, his voice filled with a reluctance that mirrored my own. "I've been here longer than I planned." "You don't have to," I said, knowing he couldn't stay. He hesitated, looking at me as if he wanted to stay, but then he shook his head. "I don't want this to be awkward," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't want you to think I was just, you know." I smiled, understanding what he meant. "I don't," I said, sitting up next to him. "You're a good man, Jacob. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened, but I don't expect anything more than what this was." He looked relieved, though there was still a hint of confusion in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to things being so simple. "So you're really okay with everything? No weird feelings or anything?" I laughed quietly, shaking my head. "No, Jacob, no weird feelings. It was just one of those moments. No strings, no pressure." He nodded slowly, as if still trying to process the simplicity of it all. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "I guess I'll see you around." "Maybe," I said, teasing him a little. "If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first person I call." That made him smile, and he stood up, grabbing his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder. But before he left, he turned back to me one last time. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft but full of sincerity, "I don't regret it. I just want you to know that." I smiled and watched as he opened the door. "Neither do I." And just like that, he was gone. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Jacob more than I should have. Every time I passed the sink, I remembered the way he had looked at me, the way his hands had trembled slightly when I touched his arm. I remembered the heat of his kiss, the way his body had pressed against mine, the way he had hesitated and then finally given in. It had been so long since I had felt like that, since I had felt anything like that. I hadn't expected him to call again. I figured he'd probably told himself it was a one-time thing, that it shouldn't happen again, and maybe he was right. Maybe it shouldn't have happened at all, but I didn't regret it, not for a second. Still, I wasn't sure if I'd ever see him again. I wasn't even sure I wanted to. The rational part of me knew that this was dangerous territory, that there was an age gap, a power dynamic, societal expectations, and the very real possibility that we were playing with fire. But the part of me that had felt so alive in his arms didn't care. I knew that if he called, I wouldn't say no. And then one afternoon, about a week after he left, my phone rang. As soon as I saw his name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected it, hadn't even hoped for it, but there it was. His name, his number, a doorway back to the excitement of what we had shared. "Hey," his voice was tentative, careful, as if he wasn't sure he should be calling. I wanted to check the tap, make sure it was still working." There was a pause, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, as if he was trying to convince himself that this was still just a business call. But we both knew better. "The tap is fine," I replied, lowering my voice just enough to let him know I wasn't talking about the sink. "But there's another problem you might be able to help me with." Another pause. I could almost hear his heartbeat quickening on the other end of the line, the hesitation that told me he was weighing his options, deciding whether or not to come back. "I'll be there in an hour," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if unsure of the decision he had just made. But deep down, I knew he couldn't stay away any more than I could resist asking him back. As I hung up the phone, a wave of anticipation washed over me. It had been a long time since I had felt this kind of excitement, a mixture of nervous energy and raw desire running through me like a current. I told myself it was just a momentary indulgence, nothing serious, nothing lasting. But the truth was, it had already become more than that. I spent the next hour pacing around the house, tidying things that didn't really need tidying, trying to calm the excitement that was building up inside me. This wasn't like me. I had never been the type to lose control, to get swept up in something so reckless. But with Jacob, all the carefully constructed walls I'd built up over the years seemed to crumble. When he finally arrived, I felt that same rush all over again. He stood in the doorway, hesitant but clearly drawn to the attraction between us. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same flicker of uncertainty that had been there the last time, but there was something else, something darker, more intense. He stepped inside and I could feel the electricity between us growing. We didn't say much as I led him to the bathroom, pretending I had a little problem that needed fixing, but we both knew why he was really there. Once we were alone in the bathroom, the air between us changed. Jacob tried to concentrate on the task at hand, his hands fiddling with the tap, but I could see his fingers trembling slightly. He was nervous, but so was I. Nervous about what we were doing, but more than that, nervous about how much I wanted this. I moved closer and watched as he pretended to inspect the tap, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the task. The silence between us was heavy, thick with unspoken desire. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I reached out and placed my hand lightly on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt. Jacob froze at my touch, his whole body stiffening for a moment. He didn't move, didn't even breathe. But then he slowly turned to face me, his eyes filled with the same conflict I had seen before. "Jacob," I whispered, my voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to pretend anymore." His breath caught, and for a moment I thought he was going to pull away again, walk away like he did last time. But then something changed in him. His expression changed, his resolve broke, his defenses crumbled. And without another word, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine with a force that left me breathless. This time, it was different. There was no hesitation, no questioning. This time, Jacob didn't hold back. His hands roamed over my body, his touch filled with a kind of urgency that sent shivers down my spine. I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair as I pressed closer, losing myself in the intensity of the moment. We didn't stop, not this time. The bathroom felt too small, too confined for what was happening between us. Without breaking the kiss, Jacob lifted me up, carrying me to the bedroom, where the boundaries between us dissolved entirely. The hours that followed were a blur of sensation and emotion, the world outside fading away as we gave in to the desire we had both tried so hard to ignore. Jacob's hands moved over my body with a kind of reverence, a need that matched my own. And in those moments, nothing else mattered. I felt alive, more alive than I had in years. It was as if the years had melted away, and I was no longer the woman who had spent so much of her life wrapped in routine, in the quiet loneliness of a big, empty house. With Jacob, I felt wanted, desired. There was no shame, no guilt, only the heat between us and the shared understanding that we both needed this. Jacob's touch was both tender and demanding, a mixture of control and release. He kissed me with a hunger that took me by surprise, his lips exploring mine with a passion that made my heart race. When we lay together afterwards, our bodies exhausted, the silence between us was comforting rather than uncomfortable. I could feel Jacob's breath on my neck, slow and steady, as his fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns on my skin. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his body next to mine, the weight of his presence. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was no need for words. We both knew that what had just happened was more than a fleeting moment of passion. It was something deeper, something neither of us had expected but couldn't deny. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Not as a 60-year-old woman, not as someone's ex-wife, but as a person, as a woman who still had the capacity to feel, to desire, to live. But reality has a way of creeping back in, no matter how hard you try to keep it at bay. As the hours passed, I began to feel the weight of what had happened settle over me. Jacob was young, so much younger than me, and although the age difference hadn't seemed to matter in the heat of the moment, I knew it couldn't be ignored forever. I glanced over at Jacob, still lying beside me, his eyes closed, his breathing even and peaceful. He looked content, but I wondered how long that contentment would last. How long before he realized the complications of what we were doing? How long before he began to pull away? The thought of it sent a shiver of fear through me. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't planned to feel anything more than a passing attraction. But now, lying here beside him, I knew it was more than that. I had become attached to him, more attached than I had ever intended. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, and wrapped the blanket around me. I stared out of the window, watching the last rays of the afternoon sun disappear behind the trees. leaving the room in a soft golden glow. This couldn't last. I knew that. The rational part of me knew that this was temporary, that what we had shared was fleeting. But another part of me, a part I hadn't acknowledged before, wanted it to last, wanted Jacob to stay. And that frightened me. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of longing and uncertainty. Jacob and I continued to see each other, but something had changed. He was still kind, still attentive, but there was a distance between us now, an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. I knew it wasn't intentional. Jacob was trying to hold on to what we had, but I could see the conflict in his eyes every time we were together. He was young, with his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was beginning to regret the path we had chosen. The age difference, which had once felt like an exciting taboo, now seemed to hang over us like a shadow. I could see the way people looked at us when we were out in public, the curious glances, the judgmental looks. It didn't matter that I felt younger when I was with Jacob, that he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't for years. To the outside world, we were something unnatural, something that didn't fit. And slowly I began to feel the weight of that judgment. One night, as we sat on the couch together, Jacob reached for my hand. His touch was warm, comforting, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart sink. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant, as if he didn't know where to begin. "About us." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I nodded, urging him to continue. "It's complicated, Margaret," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I have no regrets, but I don't know how to make this work." I knew what he meant. I had dreaded this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. We had crossed a line, and now we were both struggling to find out where we stood. "You don't have to explain," I said, my voice calm even though my heart was racing. "I know this is difficult." Jacob looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't expected. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but I can't keep pretending this is normal." His words hit me like a punch in the gut, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had known this would happen. I'd known that our relationship was built on shaky ground, that it couldn't last forever, but knowing that didn't make it any easier. After that conversation, things began to unravel between us. We still saw each other, but the easy intimacy we had once shared was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that neither of us could shake. I could feel Jacob pulling away, bit by bit, even though he tried not to. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared, afraid of losing him, afraid of going back to the life I had before, the quiet loneliness of my house, the empty days stretching out before me. It all seemed unbearable now, after everything I had felt with Jacob. One evening I sat alone in my living room, staring at my phone, wishing it would ring. Jacob had promised to come round that afternoon, but hours had passed and there was no sign of him. I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my chest. He was pulling away, and I didn't know how to stop him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jacob. "Sorry, I can't make it tonight. I need some time to think." I stared at the message, my heart sinking. I had known it was coming, but seeing it in black and white made it all the more real. I didn't react. I didn't know how to. Instead, I sat there in the dark, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. The excitement that had once filled me was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness I hadn't expected. I had thought this was just a fling, something that would make me feel alive for a while before we both moved on. But now it was more than that. I had let myself care for him, and now I was paying the price. A week went by, and Jacob didn't call. I tried to keep busy, filling my days with tasks that didn't really matter, but the emptiness followed me everywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ending, that everything we had together was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And then, one evening, just as the sun was setting, My phone rang. It was Jacob. "Can I come over?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Of course," I replied, though I already knew what was coming. When he arrived, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days, and I could see the conflict etched in every line of his face. We sat down in the living room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. I waited for him to speak, but he seemed to be struggling with what to say. "Margaret," he began, his voice soft, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I care about you," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "More than I ever thought I would, but I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend that the age difference doesn't matter. I can't pretend that this isn't complicated." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back, determined to stay composed. I had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jacob looked at me, his expression filled with regret. "I don't want to hurt you, Margaret, but I think it's best if we end this now before it gets even more complicated." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. I had known all along that this couldn't last, but knowing it didn't make the pain any less real. Jacob reached for my hand, squeezing it gently, as if trying to comfort me in a moment that offered little solace. His touch was warm, familiar, and yet it felt distant, like a reminder of something that was slipping away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for it to get this far, but I just don't know how to make this work." I looked at him, my heart breaking quietly in my chest. He was right. We had crossed a line that had felt exhilarating at the time, but now the reality of it all was sinking in. The age difference, the secrecy, the uncertainty of where this could lead. It was too much, and we both knew it. "I don't regret anything," I said softly, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I don't want you to think that." Jacob's eyes softened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, as if he were rethinking his decision. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Neither do I," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending this is something it's not." I nodded, knowing there was nothing more to say. We had shared something real, something beautiful, but it wasn't meant to last. And that was the hardest part of all, accepting that some things, no matter how powerful they feel in the moment, aren't meant to last. For a few moments we just sat there in silence, his hand still wrapped around mine. It was as if we were both trying to hold on to the last shred of what we had, knowing that it was already slipping away. Finally, Jacob stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he needed time to process what had happened. He glanced around the room, as if remembering it, and then looked back at me. "Take care, Margaret," he said quietly. "You too, Jacob," I replied, my voice calm but filled with the weight of all we hadn't said. He lingered for a moment, then turned and walked towards the door. I watched him go, my heart aching in a way I hadn't expected. The door closed softly behind him, and he was gone. The house felt impossibly quiet after he left, the silence pressing down on me like a heavy fog. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The thrill, the connection, the passion. It had all been real, but now it was over. I stood up slowly, my body heavy with exhaustion, and made my way to the bedroom. The bed felt too big, too empty without him beside me, and as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. Had I let myself fall too far? Had I allowed myself to feel too much? But even as the sadness washed over me, I knew I wouldn't change a thing. What I had shared with Jacob had awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me that I was still capable of desire, of passion, of life, and for that, I would always be grateful. The days that followed felt like they were moving in slow motion. The quiet routines of my life returned, the same familiar patterns, the same empty spaces. But something had changed. Even though Jacob was gone, the spark he had rekindled in me still flickered, refusing to go out completely. I found myself thinking about him a lot. I wondered what he was doing, what he was feeling. I knew that ending things had been the right decision for both of us, but that didn't make the longing go away. It lingered in the background, a quiet ache that I couldn't quite shake. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, cleaning the house, organizing my bookshelves, taking long walks around the neighborhood. But no matter what I did, the memories of Jacob lingered in the corners of my mind, tantalizing me with the possibility of what might have been. One afternoon, while going through some old photo albums, I came across a picture of myself from years ago, young, vibrant, full of life. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the photograph with the woman I had become. I had spent so many years trying to fit into the mold of what was expected of me, a good wife, a good mother, a responsible adult. But in the process, I had lost a part of myself. Jacob reminded me of that part, the part that longed for adventure, for connection, for something more than just going through the motions. And even though our relationship had ended, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the time we had shared. He had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, a reminder that I was still alive, still capable of feeling. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the pain of Jacob's absence began to fade. It didn't go away completely. There were still moments when I thought of him, when I felt that familiar tug of longing. But those moments became less frequent, and the emptiness in my heart began to fill with something else: acceptance. I knew now that our relationship had been a temporary reprieve from the monotony of my life, a brief but intense connection that had brought me back to myself. And although it hadn't lasted, it had done the job. I had changed. I could feel it in the way I carried myself, in the way I approached my days. The quiet loneliness that had once filled my home no longer felt so suffocating. I had found a way to reclaim my space, to make it my own again. I started catching up with old friends, reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. I joined a local book club, something I had always wanted to do but never found the time. I started painting, filling my afternoons with splashes of color and creativity that brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. And through it all, I kept the memory of Jacob tucked away in a quiet corner of my heart. I didn't dwell on it, but I didn't push it away either. It was a part of my story now, a chapter that had helped shape the person I was becoming. One evening, months after Jacob had left, I found myself sitting on the back porch, a glass of wine in hand, watching the sunset over the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, the air cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. As I sat there, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. I was content, not just with the quiet, solitary life I had rebuilt for myself, but with the knowledge that I had lived, that I had allowed myself to feel something real, even if it hadn't lasted. Jacob had come into my life unexpectedly, and just as unexpectedly, he had left. But the mark he had left on me remained. He had reminded me that life doesn't have to follow a prescribed path, that sometimes the greatest experiences come from the most unexpected places. I took a sip of my wine, smiling to myself as I thought about the future. It was uncertain, of course. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I had rediscovered a part of myself that I had thought was lost forever, and that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood up and made my way inside. The house felt warm, welcoming, no longer the cold, empty space it had once been. It was mine now, a reflection of who I was and who I was becoming. And as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it, because I had already faced the hardest part, letting go.
I never thought I'd find myself in such a delicate situation, to put it mildly, and yet here I am, sitting in our living room next to my husband Greg, with 3 guys sitting across from us. Guys he had invited himself. My heart was pounding, and a wave of confusion and fear washed over me. Greg, on the other hand, was calm, too calm. He had planned it all, and I only realized when it was too late to do anything about it. The boys, barely in their 20s, stood awkwardly by the door, clearly unsure why they had been dragged here, though curiosity was evident in their eyes. Greg had always been the adventurous type, pushing boundaries was his thing. But this was too much. "Just trust me," he whispered that morning when I expressed my doubts about his latest brilliant idea. "It'll be fine. You'll see. We'll just relax. Nothing serious, I promise." But now, standing here in my simple dress, feeling the weight of his words, the situation didn't feel light at all. Greg took a deep breath and smiled reassuringly, but it didn't help. The lump in my throat wouldn't go away. "Boys, this is my wife Claire," he introduced me as if we were having guests over for dinner. "Claire, this is Jake, Eric and Matt." I nodded politely, though my voice trembled slightly as I greeted them. Their youthful energy filled the room, and although they were polite, their presence made me uneasy. Greg kept insisting that this was just an experiment, a fun little game, but I wasn't sure what his real intentions were. "We're all just here to relax," Greg said, clapping his hands. "No pressure, no expectations." He looked at me, silently urging me to go along with whatever came next. My mouth went dry, but I trusted him, or at least I wanted to. Jake, Eric and Matt exchanged nervous glances, clearly not understanding what was going on either. I began to wonder, what had Greg told them? Did they know that this was all his idea? Did they think I'd willingly go along with this strange fantasy of his? Greg poured drinks for everyone and handed me a glass. His fingers brushed against mine, which should have been reassuring, but I saw the excitement in his eyes and it scared me. This wasn't about me, I realized. It was about him, about his strange need to prove something, to push the boundaries of our relationship. The boys sat down and Greg gestured for me to join them on the couch. I hesitated, but finally sat down on the edge. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. They started with small talk, asking me about my life, my interests, my marriage to Greg. I answered as politely as I could, but the tension in the air was heavy. Every look, every word felt loaded with unspoken meaning. When Greg leaned back on the couch with a satisfied smile, I realized this was only the beginning. Time passed, and the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Even though no one said anything directly, I felt this unspoken pressure to play along with whatever Greg had planned. Jake, Eric and Matt tried to draw me into the conversation, but I could see them looking nervously at Greg, waiting for some kind of signal. Greg sat in his chair, sipping his drink, looking completely at ease. "Why don't we go outside?" he suggested, nodding towards the patio doors. "It's a nice night, and I think we could all use some fresh air." My heart sank. I didn't want to go outside, where the dim light and seclusion would make the atmosphere even more intimate, but I felt trapped, as if there was an unspoken expectation that I follow. I glanced at Greg, hoping he'd sense my unease, but he didn't seem to notice. He was already getting up. The boys followed him out onto the terrace and I followed, feeling like I had no choice. The cool night air touched my skin as we stepped outside. The stars twinkled in the sky, a stark contrast to the heavy feeling in my chest. Greg motioned for everyone to sit around the fire, and I reluctantly sat down, trying not to look at anyone. The fire crackled merrily. Greg began to talk about the importance of trust in relationships. "Trust is everything," he said, looking at me. "And sometimes, to really trust someone, you have to step out of your comfort zone, push the boundaries a little bit." His words hung in the air, and I realized he wasn't just talking about the two of us. The boys seemed to pick up on it too. Jake, who had been the quietest so far, cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "So what exactly did you have in mind for tonight, Greg?" he asked carefully, lowering his voice. Greg smiled, still looking at me. "I think Claire needs to loosen up a bit," he said casually, as if stating an obvious fact. "She's always been a bit reserved, a bit shy, and I thought tonight would be a good opportunity for her to relax, to feel freer." His words made my stomach clench. This wasn't what I had signed up for. I had agreed to something harmless, something playful. But here I was, sitting under the stars with three strangers looking at me expectantly. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I could feel Greg's eyes on me, waiting for my answer. Eric shifted nervously in his seat, glancing between Greg and me. "I'm not sure we should be pushing her into this," he began, but Greg cut him off. "Relax," Greg said, still smiling. "It's all just for fun. Claire knows that, don't you, darling?" His question hung in the air, and I couldn't find the words to answer it. My mind raced, trying to understand how I had ended up in this situation. Did Greg want me to play out some fantasy with these guys? Was this a test of my loyalty? Or was he just seeing how far he could push me? Jake, Eric, and Matt were clearly uncomfortable now, their initial curiosity fading. They had probably come here expecting a fun evening, thinking Greg had something exciting in store for them. But now they seemed to realize how serious things had become. I took a deep breath and stood up, breaking the tense silence. "I think I need a minute," I said, my voice shaking slightly. I turned to the door, hoping Greg wouldn't stop me. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard his voice. "Claire," he said softly, but there was something commanding in his tone. "You're not going anywhere." I froze, my hand still on the cold metal of the door handle. Greg's words hung heavy in the air. My heart was pounding, and for a moment I wanted to just run, to open the door and escape back into the house, away from the suffocating tension. But I didn't move. I don't know if it was because I was afraid of embarrassing Greg, or because of that silent, pleading look I saw in his eyes when he spoke. Either way, I slowly turned around and forced a smile, trying to hide the storm of emotions raging inside me. The boys exchanged awkward glances, their discomfort obvious, but they remained seated, unsure of what to do. "Sit down, Claire," Greg said quietly, his tone changing from commanding to coaxing, as if trying to calm me down. "You're overthinking this." I hesitated for another moment, but finally sat back down. My mind was racing. What was Greg up to? I wasn't naive. Greg had always liked to push boundaries, to test me, but this was something completely different. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the patio, adding to the already tense atmosphere. "We've been married for 10 years now?" Greg said, addressing both of us. I looked at the boys. They were waiting for my answer, but I could see the unease in their faces. They weren't on board either, not with what Greg was suggesting, but they were deferring to him, unsure of what to do. I don't know what you want from me," I whispered, barely audible. I felt small, as if the weight of Greg's expectations were crushing me. I loved him, I always have, but this situation was turning into something I wasn't prepared for. Greg's expression softened a little, but I could still see the determination in his eyes. "I just want you to let go, Claire," he said, "to stop holding yourself back. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, but you have to trust me. Can you do that?" The question felt like a trap. I wanted to trust him, but trust didn't mean blindly following him into a place where I felt vulnerable and exposed. I glanced back at the boys, who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure how to handle the tension. Jake leaned forward, breaking the silence. "We can just talk, no pressure. Let's not rush into anything." His voice was calm, but I could tell he was trying to diffuse the situation. Greg smiled, seemingly pleased. "Exactly. Let's just talk." He leaned back, his eyes still on me, waiting for me to agree. But inside I was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about talking, at least not for Greg. I sat there, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me. The crackling of the fire seemed to reflect the tension in the air, as if the flames themselves reflected the pressure I was under. Greg's words echoed in my head. Just let go. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready for what he was about to turn this evening into, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It wasn't about me. It never was. Jake, Eric, and Matt exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing my discomfort. They hadn't expected this turn of events, and it seemed they were looking for a way out, just as I was. Jake cleared his throat, trying once again to break the heavy silence. Look, Claire, if you're not comfortable, we can just call it a day. No hard feelings. His words felt like a lifeline, and I wanted so much to grab onto it. But Greg's eyes were fixed on me, his expression calm but insistent, as if he was waiting for me to make a decision that would define our relationship from now on. He had never pushed me like this before, and now I was standing on the edge of something I didn't want to fall into. I think it's a good idea, I finally said, my voice trembling but firm enough. I'm uncomfortable, Greg. I agreed to try something new, but this isn't what I expected. Greg's face hardened for a moment, a flash of disappointment crossing his expression. He took a deep breath, as if trying to control his emotions, then slowly nodded. I understand, he said, but his tone was cold. I just thought you might want to step out of your comfort zone for once. I jumped at his words. He wasn't just disappointed, he was hurt. But I couldn't let him manipulate me. Greg, I've always trusted you, but this isn't right. I can't just pretend to enjoy this because you want me to. The three boys, sensing that the night was coming to an end, slowly stood up. Jake gave me a sympathetic look as he put his glass down on the table. We didn't mean to cause any tension, he said quietly, turning to me. I hope you can work things out. Eric and Matt echoed his sentiment, apologizing for the awkward situation they had inadvertently become a part of. They gathered their things, nodding politely to Greg before heading for the door, clearly eager to leave. As the door closed behind them, the house fell silent. Greg stood by the fire, staring into the flames, his jaw clenched. I looked at him, not knowing what to say. Part of me felt guilty for not going along with his plan, but a stronger part of me knew I had done the right thing. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice calm but full of disappointment. I thought you wanted more, that you wanted excitement. You've been saying for months how bored you were, how tired of the routine. I just wanted to give you something different. I sighed and moved closer to him, keeping a little distance. I do want change, Greg, I said gently, but not like this. This wasn't for us. It was for you. You were testing me, seeing how far I'd go, and that's not the kind of trust I want in our marriage. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the fire. I could see the thoughts running through his mind, disappointment slowly giving way to understanding. He took a deep breath and finally looked at me. Maybe I went too far, he admitted, his voice softer now. I was just trying to shake things up between us, not realizing how much pressure I was putting on you. Relief washed over me as I heard those words. It's okay to want change, Greg, I said gently, but we have to do it together, not like this, not by bringing other people into it. We need to communicate better, find out what we both want without crossing boundaries that make one of us uncomfortable. He nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. You're right, he said quietly. I pushed too hard. I'm sorry, Claire. For the first time that night, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Greg and I still had a lot to talk about, a lot to work out, but at least for now we were back on the same page. I reached out and took his hand, knowing that tonight would change our relationship. But in the end, maybe it would be for the better.
I was 63, recently retired from my long teaching career and living in a quiet, quaint house on the outskirts of town. I had embraced a slower, more peaceful life. My husband had passed away 5 years ago, And since then, I'd found solace in a predictable routine: gardening, reading, and occasional outings with a few close friends. The house had grown quiet, and though I missed companionship, I had come to terms with where I stood in life. The simplicity suited me. But my world took a surprising turn when my stepson, Alex, called me one day. Alex was 22, fresh out of college, and was trying to establish himself in the competitive field of graphic design. He had ambitions of launching his career in the city, but was struggling to find steady work. As a result, he was also having difficulty keeping up with his rent. I hadn't heard from Alex in a while. He hadn't kept in touch after his father passed, and we had never been particularly close. We got along fine, but there was always a sense of formality between us. When he called, his voice was hesitant, as if he didn't know how to approach what he wanted to say. "Hey, Mara," he began. "I know it's been a while, but I need to ask for a favor." I could sense the weight of his words before he even finished the sentence. He was in a tough spot, and I instinctively knew what he was going to ask. After explaining his situation, I didn't hesitate. "Of course, Alex, you can stay with me as long as you need, until you find a stable job and a place of your own." The words slipped out easily, but there was a nervousness gnawing at me. What would it be like having someone young, especially a man, living under my roof again? I hadn't shared my space with anyone for years, and the thought of it made me anxious. Nevertheless, I made preparations for his arrival. The morning Alex was due to move in, I busied myself making sure everything in the guest room was perfect. I fluffed the pillows, dusted the shelves, and stocked the bathroom with fresh towels. As the hours passed, I grew more uneasy. This wasn't just about having a house guest. It was about disrupting the routine that had kept me grounded for years. When Alex finally pulled up in his old beat-up car, I was waiting for him on the porch. I hadn't seen him in a long time, and as he stepped out of the car, I was taken aback. He wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered. He had grown into a tall, broad-shouldered young man with a newfound confidence that radiated off him. "Hey, Mara," he said, with a smile that felt both familiar and strange. He pulled me into a quick hug, his scent woodsy and fresh, catching me off guard. "Welcome," I replied, feeling momentarily out of place. "I hope the drive wasn't too bad." "Not at all," he said, brushing it off casually. "Thanks for letting me stay here." Those first few days were quiet, almost uneventful. Alex mostly stayed in his room or went out looking for jobs. I made a conscious effort to give him space, not wanting to be the overbearing stepmother. But slowly, the house began to feel different. There was an energy that hadn't been there before, and I couldn't help but notice small things. The way Alex would smile at me across the dining table, or how he lingered in the kitchen, talking to me about his day. One evening, something unexpected happened. It was late, and I had gone to bed early as usual. The house was still and quiet when I heard the faint creak of my bedroom door. Groggy, I turned over to see Alex standing in the doorway. "Alex?" I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. "Is everything okay?" He stepped further into the room, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. There was something different in his posture, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I couldn't sleep," he said softly, walking closer to the bed. I sat up, rubbing my eyes and trying to shake off the grogginess. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the edge of the bed. I could feel the mattress sink under his weight. The space between us filled with an odd tension. "I don't know," he sighed. "I guess I'm just feeling a little lost." There was a rawness in his voice that tugged at my heart. For all his outward confidence, Alex was still so young, still figuring things out. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand gently on his arm, offering a small gesture of comfort. "You'll be okay," I whispered. "Everyone goes through rough patches." For a brief moment, Our eyes met, and the air between us seemed to thicken. I don't know how else to describe it, but something had changed. I should have pulled away, should have said something to break the tension, but instead I let my hand linger on his arm a little longer than necessary. "Thanks, Mara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unsure of what to say. He stood up slowly, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment longer, before turning and walking back to his room. As the door clicked shut behind him, I lay back down, my heart racing. I didn't know what to make of the moment we had just shared. Was I reading too much into it, or had something really shifted between us?